pieces, so this is great. And just cannot overemphasize how important it is to have your participation in this process. Participation at the meeting itself, but we also really value your comments in writing. Some folks are not comfortable standing up at a meeting and providing comments, so please, we encourage you to provide comments in writing. They're important to us in this study to make it the best study that we can, given the time constraints and everything else we have going on. So just a refresher, the purpose of the project, this is the same as the last meeting. The purpose has not changed. We're looking at solutions to address our short and long-term energy needs, taking into account all three of these. It's important that we have all three taken into account: the greenhouse gas reduction, economic impacts and benefits, and system reliability. So we're continuing down that path. Synapse is going to provide an update as to where we are, based on the input from the last meeting and the work they've done since then, and lay out the path from here. And with that, I just want to say thank you again for being here and comment.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Raffenberg Associates. I'm the facilitator for the remainder of the process. Let me just get a show of hands. How many people were not at the first meeting? Okay. So we're gonna go over what today's purpose, the agenda, a little bit of the ground rules. Some of those folks would have heard last time. And then we're going to get going. We have a lot of things that we want to cover today, both substantively and presentations from Synapse, but we also, unlike the first meeting, want to give you some chances to interact with each other and listen to each other. And hopefully that will improve the process, short and long term, here in Massachusetts and your comments. Okay, so the objectives of this meeting, we've divided it into two parts. In the morning, we're going to be talking about the key modeling assumptions. We get an update, including additional detail from Synapse than you had at the last meeting. We're going to give you a chance in small groups to come up with some questions for Synapse, and then we'll also allow for any individual questions or comments after that. Then the afternoon, which is the lengthier part of the meeting, we'll be talking about the feasibility analysis. So this you haven't seen yet, unless you looked at the slides last night. Synapse will do a presentation on the feasibility analysis, the approach, assumptions that are going in. We'll take some clarifying questions, and then we're going to break you up differently in the afternoon. We're going to break you up in sort of like-minded stakeholder groups. We have another couple of rooms, and then we're going to want you to come back with some initial comments, and then again, we want people to reflect on what we've heard today, look at things a little more deeply, and then Synapse and DOER will take written comments next Tuesday. Okay, so this is a little more detailed agenda on how we're going to do it. The only thing I'd add today is that DOER is providing lunch so that we can kind of keep you all here and keep things moving and give you some additional time to interact. And then in the afternoon, we'll break the feasibility analysis into two parts. The first part will be the presentation from Synapse with clarifying questions from whoever has any, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll move you into your stakeholder groups. And then we'll come back, hear what the small group discussions led to, and then we'll talk about the next steps in modeling and in the stakeholder process, and we'll have to go out by 3:45. So the ground rules are the same for last time. It's really important when you're speaking to state your name and your affiliation, so we know who you are, so everybody knows who you are. I want you to share your feedback with affirmations or alternatives. If you don't like something, what we need is alternatives. This is a fast-moving modeling process, as you know, and DOER and Synapse are going to have to make many decisions along the way. Be succinct in your comments and questions. We have, if everybody shows up, we're going to have 100 people in the room today, so it'll be packed. Silence your phones, please, and dial in participants. There'll be a couple of opportunities to ask questions at the end of the questions from folks in the room. But also be a lot of time today where people are working in small groups that over the phone you can go do something else for an hour. We'll tell you how long that will last. So the materials will be are available. I think you saw the cover slide. They've been working furiously on the feasibility analysis and on the slides. Even last night, there are a few slight modifications. So they're reposted this morning at 9. They might be reposted again, by the end of today, based on things. So you just have to keep looking at the website. The meetings are open to the public. We're going to keep providing you with high-level meeting summaries. And just to say, this isn't a consensus modeling process. Again, the more convergence, the better, but we don't have time or the effort to get everybody, nor do we expect it, but we think that the modeling will benefit from your involvement and your engagement and your feedback as we go. So the written comments, we'll talk at the end about it, but I think they're due close of business on Tuesday. This is the address. We'll go back over this again. And just to say, the last formal stakeholder meeting will be on November 20th. We have this room reserved. We're going to want to see how it works today. It's really tight, obviously. But it is free, and it is at a very good location. So it'll probably be here again. We're not sure, but there'll be final written comments, and then the final report's going to be out on December 23rd. Any quick questions for me before I turn it over to Liz to go over the modeling assumptions? Okay. Liz? And do we have anybody on the phone? Okay, we're not going to go. That's okay. We just wanted to make sure it was working. We had 50 people last time, so we'll figure out later how many we have. But welcome, folks on the phone. And we've got the loudspeaker right near the phone, so you shouldn't have any trouble.
Hi, everybody. Is that working?
Yeah.
I've been having some laryngitis this week, so you're going to have to bear with me, and I hope my voice holds out through the day. My name is Liz Stanton. I'm with Synapse Energy Economics, and I have with me today a few of my colleagues, Leo Strini, Pat Knight, Bob Bacon, and we're going to be joined by some other Synapse team members in the afternoon who have some more input on the topics that we're talking about in the afternoon. So what we're going to do this morning is walk our way through the basic model design and some of our key modeling assumptions, and in the afternoon walk our way through the feasibility analysis that we've been working on. I want to emphasize that everything that we're doing is a work in progress. We've been working on the project for about 3 weeks now and have covered a lot of ground in that time, but I think that I'm hoping that people will react to the things that we're presenting not as something final that's set in stone, but something that we're working on, we're interested in getting feedback on, and we're working to have the best product possible. Sorry, that's a little disturbing. So these are the main items that I'm going to talk about now for the presentation on, and then I'm sure there'll be things that you wish I'd gone into more depth about and answer your questions about that after my presentation. So I'm going to start out by talking about the basic modeling objectives and then go into some of these design elements. And I think that must be a problem with the projector, and probably not something that you can hear, so sorry about that. So some of the material that I'm going to go over now, you've heard before if you were at the previous meeting or have been reading materials that they've come out, or there may be a little bit of duplication. We're working to put together a model that joins the market analytics model, which is an electric mismatch model from Ventex, together with an Excel model that we're in the process of building at Synapse. To join those two things together to meet these two objectives. And the first thing is that we're looking at the sufficiency of gas pipeline capacity. And we're going to be looking at that in a winter peak event. A little bit further on here, I'm going to describe what we mean by a winter peak event, and we're really glad to hear people's feedback about that. But this is one of the things that we're looking to understand with this project is what is the sufficiency of gas pipeline capacity during a constraint period. In addition to that, we're going to be modeling annual costs and annual emissions of the electric sector and of the gas sector, so both things. And that's basically what we're trying to do. There's lots of complexities to it. We're doing a number of different scenarios, and I'm going to try to walk you through the basics of what our modeling project is. Okay. So this is a very high-level schematic showing the modeling project as the different pieces of it. We have the market analytics electric dispatch model. We're feeding into that inputs that are the SELT forecast, which is the electric forecast that comes from ISO New England, and also a generation mix of what are the resources for generation that are out there going into the future that we put together for a different project for DOER. And the purpose of that project or that particular modeling run was to show all of the Green Communities Act, the impacts of all the Green Communities Acts on the generation mix, on all those policies on the generation mix, the 6 New England states RPS policies, making sure they're represented in that generation mix, and other basic, what you expect to see in a baseline for current policy going into the future. And we're also working now to put together a spreadsheet model of Massachusetts gas capacity and demand, and looking at the balance between those two things. Going into that, there'll be the LDC, gas LDC's demand forecast. We're going to be looking at capacity forecast that we're bringing together, all of this for public resources. And also information about what historical constraint events, winter peak events have been like, bring that all together into this model. From the market analytics, we get what the gas requirements are during a winter constraint event too, a winter peak event. And then for both of these, we're looking at the annual costs, annual emissions, and then from the spreadsheet model, we'll have a process for looking at the balance between gas capacity and gas demand. So in a very broad strokes, that's the project that we're working on, is to try to figure out what are all the gas requirements, compare them to what's expected for gas capacity, see what that balance is. Here's a little bit more description about the winter peak event than we gave at the last meeting. It's still a work in progress, as I said, but some of the details that people were looking for, this is how we're looking at modeling it. So winter peak event is a series of particularly cold winter days, and we're looking at the capacity and demand in the peak hour for what's called a design day, and this is a term from the gas LDCs that they use. Yes, each LDC has a slightly different design day definition. We're working with the data that we get from the LDCs to represent that. We want to take that peak hour on a winter day from the gas side, from the LDC gas side, and figure out what's coincident with that, what comes at the same moment as that on the electric side. So the gas requirement from the electric side that we're interested in is the one that coincides with the peak, the constraint on the gas side, and to figure out what at that peak moment is being required of gas, demanded of gas on both sides. And our expectation for that is that that occurs on a day in January at 6 to 7 in the evening is when that coincident peak occurs. We want to also take into account the effect of a cold snap, a series of these cold winter days. And we've also found in examining the LDC's data that each LDC for Massachusetts has a different definition of a cold snap event. That range pretty widely. They're all series of cold winter days. They look at historically what was the coldest series of days, but they each have a different number of days that they use. we're zooming in on Massachusetts' two largest LDCs and taking the average of those two, so one is 10 and one is 14 days. We're going to use 12 days as being our cold snap as a way to represent it for the state. So these are some just big ideas about what our winter peak event is. We want to zoom in on the demands in a particular hour to look at the cusp of a constraint event, but we also want to look at the impact that having a series of cold days all in a row can have on various kinds of storage that we have in a gas system, so that when you get to that hour, it certainly has an effect on how much storage, what kind of resources you can draw on, how many winter days or how much cold weather has come before that. So that's the basic idea of a winter peak event that they're putting together. We welcome feedback and trying to refine that. We're doing 8 scenario and sensitivity combinations to try to represent various different possibilities about the future. We have a base case and our low demand case. The base case is what I've been describing about the sort of most expected case, the case that represents existing policy, what's existing statutes going forward. It's meant to represent the published forecast of ISO New England, of the LDCs. That's the base case. And we will build off of that base case and add to it to get to the low demand case. So everything will be in the base case, and then what we're going to add on top of that is the results of the feasibility analysis that we're talking about today. And the purpose of the feasibility analysis is to say how much of various kinds of alternative resources could or should we add to the system. And we're going to talk lots about what that means. How much can you add? What does it mean that you should or could? We'll talk about those things, but that's the idea. Take some alternative resources, add them to the base case, make sure it makes sense, right? We're not going to just dump them in and then not consider how things interact with each other, make a sensible future scenario out of it, and that's our low demand case. So I know we have a lot to talk about what should go in the low demand case. In the reference case, we're using a reference natural gas price, and we'll show a slide with our different natural gas prices. And we're also using the assumption that there is no incremental transmission from Canada above what we have today. That's the first case, base case, low case. We're going to look at 2 different sensitivities on that. The first one is the natural gas price. We will look at the base case and the low case using a low natural gas price, lower than our reference, and using a high natural gas price, higher than our reference. Okay? And then, in addition, we have a final sensitivity. It's at the reference natural gas price. We will look at what if there is incremental transmission from Canada, and the case that we're looking at is 2,400 megawatts of additional capacity. So these are the 8 cases that we'll be examining, and for each of these cases, we'll be providing the outputs that I was describing, the balance between gas capacity and demand, and then the annual costs and the annual emissions. There are a few more details about the base case. It's not saying anything more than what I just described about it. We're trying to incorporate in it all existing policy, and that's all existing policy of the New England states, where there are interconnections to other regions. We're trying to capture that to get the best representation of it that we can. We're trying to represent an expected future here if there were no policy changes. Right? If nothing happened to change policy, here's a good representation of an expected future. In it, we will be using, and this does represent a change from what I said at the last meeting, we're going to be using carbon allowance prices, and I said a different series at the last meeting. This is something that's been updated and based on the input from DOER. And what we are doing is for the carbon allowance prices, we're using the allowance prices that apply in the electricity sector. And the price series going forward that we'll be using is the one that's used in the AESC 2013 base case. For those of you that are familiar with that, it will be the RGGI forecast, publicly available RGGI forecast going out to 2020, which is when that forecast ends. And then after that, we are putting in values from our Synapse CO2 price forecast report, which we put out every 1 to 2 years. It's very widely used in the industry. And that's going to take the place of the RGGI price going out after 2020. You can interpret that in a number of different ways as to what's the right price to put as you go out forward. Because there is no RGGI forecast past 2020, the other option would be to have it be flat in real terms, which doesn't seem like quite the right assumption either. And so this is what we're doing. This keeps the price growing slowly over time. And gives a representation of a potential expected CO2 price for the electric sector going out to the future. For the low demand case, we are looking at all the alternative resources that can be utilized. And these are all the resources that are together, both of these things, technically and economically feasible. And obviously that's something that we need to circle back to when we're talking about the feasibility analysis. What is technically feasible? What is economically feasible? But the resources that are determined to have those two characteristics to them will be incorporated into the low demand case. That includes both resources on the load side and resources on the generation or gas supply side. All kinds of resources could be in there. We're looking broadly at the idea. The assumption is that changes to public policy are assumed for Massachusetts, but not for the neighboring states. Neighboring states will maintain their current policies. This is about policy changes that we can make in Massachusetts. That does not mean that all of the resources that we're describing, for example, if you think about renewable resources as an example, okay, it does not mean that all of those resources would have to be located in Massachusetts. Just like with our RPS policy today, we create an incentive that makes it possible for there to be additional renewable resources all over New England and even some in Canada, right? That the restriction that we're just looking at Massachusetts policy doesn't mean that for, at least for renewable resources, that those must be located in Massachusetts necessarily. We're using the same carbon allowance price in terms of a price that is put into our market analytics model, and the effect that that has is to change what the electric generator is bidding into the system. The market analytics model gives a representation of how this actually happens in ISO New England. And so having that allowance in there means that for those generators that do emit carbon dioxide, that it raises their costs. And then the decision of what is actually going to run at any given moment in New England, what generators are going to run, is based on an economic decision. That's what the economic dispatch is. So if some of those resources are more expensive, they may not run. And we're using the same price series, though, as in the base case. That's not the way in which we're adding the alternative resources. We're adding the alternative resources by having the feasibility study, deciding what would be built, and putting it into the system. Right? And then the economic dispatch will occur with those resources available to it. So the model will have those resources available to it to run or not run, depending on what's economic. We're checking the screen. Okay. The natural gas price sensitivity. So these are our three natural gas prices. What I'm showing here is the Henry Hub. We will be using the New England basis, but we haven't developed it yet, or we haven't finalized it yet. So I'm showing you the New England, the Henry Hub. The middle one, the blue, is our mid or reference price. And then you see the low and the high. You can see what the range is here. These are in real terms, in dollars per MMBTU. This is something that I think I'll leave it at that, and if people have questions about it, you can direct it back in questions. But where it stands now, these are the prices that we're planning to use, and I know that that's something that there were some stakeholder comments about, and so it's a good point for discussion. Also, a brief description of the incremental Canadian transmission sensitivity. So as I mentioned, we're looking at the case of an additional 2,400 megawatts of new incremental transmission from Canada. Our assessment is that half of that could be available in 2018, and half of it could be available in 2022, the other half. From looking in detail at the way in which the current lines run, and also at the availability of generation capacity in Canada, our determination is that on a winter peak day, the average capacity factor would be 75% on those lines, and in a winter peak hour, it would be 100%. And we're happy to talk about that and take questions about it, but those are the assumptions that we're going on. Those are the assumptions that we're going on at the moment. I don't want to indicate that we're not going to take comments to it by intention. This gives a little bit more detail showing the annual capacity factor and of the two different lines, each 1,200 line, and then the annual net cost, and also energy production and the impact on peak as well. And the last thing that I wanted to point out was that, as Jonathan said, we've been working furiously on this and have been even since we submitted the memo and the slides to DOER a couple days ago. This is one thing that in our review since then we've pulled out as being an issue and an assumption that we are planning to change, and that's that throughout the calculations, when we're translating electric resources into what kind of effect do they have on gas requirements, we use the assumption of the heat rate that would be appropriate to the unit that was on the margin at peak time, which is a much higher heat rate. I know this is in the weeds, sorry. This is a much higher heat rate than what the average would be. So our thought about this is that a more appropriate heat rate for doing the annual assumptions, for looking at what generation and what gas displacement there would be annually, would be an annual average heat rate. And so it's our plan to and glad to hear feedback on this, is to change from the one heat rate assumption to the other one, the lower heat rate assumption. This is going to affect, for anything that's an electric resource, it's going to affect the amount of gas displacement that's expected from that. Basically, when we get to the supply curve part, it'll affect the widths, right? The widths of the supply curve. It would not affect, though, the determination of what was over or under a price threshold, but it would affect those widths, and I just wanted to make everybody aware of it, that that's something that's in progress.
Okay, so I want to talk about where we're going to proceed. We're going to have a lot of time for questions and also for your comments until 11:45, and we're actually a little ahead of schedule. But what we'd like you to do now is that you're in theory randomly assigned just based on when you came in. We purposely wanted to just have mixed groups. There's a lot of different expertise and experience in the room. Obviously, this is complicated modeling things, but we wanted to have a chance to talk with others And we want you to do a few things. So one is that you start just by introducing yourselves, what your name is and your organization. Then we want you to share your perspectives with each other, because we're assuming there are some very different perspectives on what Synapse's proposed approach and assumptions regarding the things that they've just talked about. Again, we really want to stay laser focused on the topics that we're talking about, because, you know, as you can see, there's lots of decisions that Synapse and DOER need to make along the way in the modeling, and so we're taking kind of piece by piece. So in the afternoon, we'll deal with the feasibility analysis, but here, what we'd like you to talk about are these three things: the winter peak event, the scenarios for base case and low demand case, and then the sensitivities for natural gas price and for the incremental transmission. And through the course of your conversation with each other, sharing what you're wondering about, Terry, see if you could come up as a group with 2 or 3 questions that you want to ask Synapse that during the course of your discussions, like, well, we don't understand exactly what they mean or what they're doing or why they picked that assumption. And see if you could collectively come up with 2 or 3. We'll go around the room and have those group questions when we come back together. And then we'll have another 30 minutes for any individual questions that you haven't had answered and your comments. Okay, so if you've got some comments that you want to put out before the group on any of this, we'll take those then. And then again, you'll all have another opportunity in writing by next Tuesday. So the idea is we'll have 35 minutes right now until 11:45 to have a conversation with the people you happen to be sitting with at the table about these issues, and see if you can come up with 2 or 3 questions that you want as a group to ask. Okay? And if anybody's having a possible time hearing at the table, we have 1 or 2 other little groups that we're official. Do is, first of all, we need you to just focus on these. If you're asking a question that's not related to this, the things we're going to be covering this afternoon, we're going to jettison it until the afternoon, okay? And we'll go around and we'll have each table do 1 question, and then we'll go around again. We'll just keep going until we've got your questions answered or we run out of time. So let me start with table 1. First question. And we've got the Synapse team up there, feeling what it's like to be DP commissioners, and so they'll answer your questions, and then we'll go from there. Nils, and again, name and organization.
Hi, I'm Nils Bolgan, Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. This might be a question for Synapse or even DOER. It has to do with the group. I think we understand the focus on peak demand, because it's a question of sort of keeping the lights on, keeping the boilers burning in the basements, things like that. But we wanted to understand a little bit more about how measures that address peak demand would provide benefits throughout the year and sort of make broader scale changes in our electricity or thermal mix.
So it's a question of capturing those benefits?
Capturing it and actually, how might that information be used also? That's, I think, maybe where I'm thinking it's more of a DOER type of question.
So I'll address it first. And just to clarify, are you referring to the alternative resources that are part of the feasibility study? Are those the measures that you're talking about?
Or just the whole outputs
It's not the whole output.
and analysis?
Then I think you're going to have to ask the question again. I don't think I'm understanding the question. Can you try it one more time?
Sure. So, and I think part of the output is annual energy mix and emissions. Can you explain a little bit? Describe some of the value of that in terms of how our overall electric system and thermal system might be changing, and then maybe how DOER might benefit from, or policymakers might benefit from that information also.
Thank you. So The work that Synapse is doing is not going to be making policy recommendations. We have the scenarios that have been selected by DOER, and we're doing scenario analysis to give our best estimation of, under those circumstances, what would occur in the future. We're going to provide those results to DOER and comparisons between them to DOER. So I'll turn to Meg to see if you have a mic over there, Meg?
This is what
You
happens.
share the other one?
Okay, this works now, right?
No, that doesn't work.
Oh,
Yep.
okay. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, what Liz said is correct. You know, as we look at different scenarios and, you know, to look at the low demand scenario, we will be identifying if there are policy changes needed, but there aren't recommendations for policy changes. And, you know, this is information then that we will take, you know, this administration will look at it, and it will definitely be used by, you know, the next administration to help inform any, you know, policy decisions that will be made, you know, going forward.
Let me jump in because I'm not sure that you exactly address what they were asking, which is, will the modeling also be showing and looking at annual benefits and not just benefits to the electric system and thermal system? I think that's what you're talking about. Yeah.
And the answer is yes, it will.
Okay. Table 2. Who drew the long straw?
Short story on Washington.
Name and orange.
My name is Ken Berthium. I represent the North Development Action Pipeline Group. And a couple of, we start. One clarifying question. The peak calculations will be using both historical peak and forecasted peak?
The plan at this point is to focus on historical, is to focus on a forecast for peak. It doesn't mean that we're ignoring the historical information, but there are a lot of things that are going to be changing as we go out into the future, including loads. And so we're looking for the design days. We're taking that from the LDC's forecast out for the next 5 years. And then from there, we need to forecast forward. So we're not, the LDCs and people that have this job in the room can probably answer this better than I can, but the LDCs are looking at historical events when they're putting together their 5-year forecasts. And then we're looking at the 5-year forecasts and then thinking about how loads will change and going forward from there. Does that answer?
So by default, they'll actually, we'll be looking at the historical based on the ODC forecast, assuming they want to be historical.
Yes.
Okay.
Table number 3.
Hi, I'm Dave Maloney. I'm with the New Hampshire Pipeline Awareness Board. But I also work at the New Hampshire Mass Crack, no crack gas events. We talked a lot about liquid natural storage at this table, and the general question would be, how can we place an emphasis on the low demand scenario that includes as much capacity for liquid natural gas as is available, and include that in the study. I did a calculation myself just based on.
Let's get the question.
Okay, so we know that liquid natural gas currently is based on an expectation of demand that might be available. So it's purely speculative in the business realm. And we build, for instance, water towers, municipal towers for water. Why don't we build municipal towers for liquid natural gas? Or not towers, but dams for liquid natural gas, especially with cryogenic availability that lowers cost very low. So the question would be, if we're going to look at these things, can we look at what the actual capacity of liquid natural gas suppliers are now, and rather than focus strictly on their demand requirements, but look at what our overall requirements are for natural gas and base the liquid natural gas availability on that supply.
And I think we're going to cover that some this afternoon. But
We are going to cover that to the extent that more liquid natural gas injection would be included over and above what would be in a base case. That would be a topic for the afternoon. But I am going to give Leo a chance to talk about this a little bit now because he's been looking into this for us and he's not going to be here in the afternoon.
Yeah, I think is this on?
Yeah.
What we're looking at is what the existing capacity is now. It's not just the storage, but it's the vaporization. And what vaporization capacity do you have on peak day? As we look at sensitivity, certainly you can say, well, what if you have more vaporization capacity on a peak day? What does that do to your capacity requirements or your availability? I don't know that we're looking at that specifically just yet, but I think to answer your question, we are going to be looking at the full capacity of on a peak day.
And we can talk about how that will come into the
You have a
analysis
comment?
later.
Is it related to this?
So does increased vaporization require additional tanks or some new infrastructure on existing tanks?
It would, well, it could be both, but it's primarily additional infrastructure on existing plants.
Table number 4. Introduce yourself.
Jerry Oppenheim from the Low Income Network. So one question we had was, we were unclear about the distinction between the high demand event described and extreme weather, which seems to be different. You plan for one, you plan for a high demand event, as we understood it, but not for extreme weather. So what's the difference?
So what we're working off of is the idea of what the gas LDCs call a design day. And so it is a high demand event. It is, to my understanding, based around the idea that that would be a day of extreme weather, that the two things are happening in coincidence. That's a yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And then also, as Liz mentioned, looking at a cold snap, which is a series of extreme cold events, and what happens to the system under those conditions.
Do you have a comment or a follow-up question?
The follow-up question. Because it doesn't really answer my question. One of the slides, and I'll try to find it in a second. Oh, thank you. Distinguishes between the two. All right, so slide 14. Annual costs and emissions will be modeled based on expected, most likely weather conditions. Sounds like the design that you're talking about, not extreme conditions. These expected weather conditions will include the occurrence of winter high demand events. So it does include high demand, doesn't include extreme conditions. I don't understand the difference.
I think that may be just poor wording on our part. We're looking for to be able to model annual conditions going out into the future. We expect that there will be some probability of a design days occurring and some probability of these winter peak events occurring. So I wouldn't read too much into that distinction that you're drawing here, that in a year there will be periods of cold weather.
Lawyer.
Okay, table 5.
Earl Hartman, Environmental Entrepreneurs. I'm going to follow up with another LNG question. We were wondering what assumptions you're making about the new ISO LNG winter program and the pay for performance rules.
I think that we'll come back to that in the afternoon. We're going to have Doug Hurley with us, and he's really the best person to try to address those questions for us. So we'll circle back to that in the afternoon.
You want to take the second question, Laura?
Okay. The second question has to do with the assumptions around Canadian hydro. In one case, you assume it's there. In the other case, you assume it's not there. When you assume it's there, how sure are you, or how do you make sure that it really is there? What assumptions go into the idea that we will actually have 2,400 megawatts coming down from Canada. And the reason behind the thinking behind the question is that we know that on very cold weather, extreme days, they also tend to have similar weather in Canada, and we've seen that power be shipped to Canada, or at least we would fear it would be shipped to Canada rather than come down to us.
I'm going to let Bob Fagan answer this, but I want to say first, just to clarify, the difference between the difference between the other cases and the sensitivity where there is the hydro sensitivity or the Canadian transmission sensitivity is about incremental to today, right? So they both have what's expected today, and then there's an incremental amount in that sensitivity. But Bob, do you want to go into that?
Yeah, sure. The first part of your question, the answer is we don't know. It's a sensitivity. It's a sensitivity so we can determine, well, what does the system look like? What are the effects if it were there? We're not making a statement that it's going to be there. What we're trying to do is show what the modeling results look like if it were there. That's an important piece of information to think about policy. So that's the answer to your first question. A close point is when you do modeling, sometimes you do sensitivities that are looking at a particular scenario that we don't know if it's going to happen or not. There's a lot of indication that it could happen. We want to see technically what goes on with the system if it was there. The answer to your second question, what we've seen for the existing Canadian lines coming down into New England is that they, on winter peak days when the prices are high, they flow as much energy as they possibly can. Now there's limits on the existing lines coming in, and there may be limitations on the new lines coming in, but generally, if they build a line, and Canada has the ability to inject into the line in Canada, on days when the prices are that high in New England, it flows, and the data prove that out. Now there are some limitations on the existing line, on the big line coming into New England, the phase 2 into Sandy Pond, because the rest of the region can only handle it up to 1,800 megawatt bundle, and it's rated at 2,000. That constraint does not apply to these 1,100 or 1,200 megawatt lines that could possibly come in. So generally, if they build that line, and Hydro-Quebec builds the infrastructure to allow it to inject at the rated level of the line, on the winter peak days when the economics are such that the prices are well into the hundreds of dollars a megawatt hour or higher, that energy is going to flow. That's what we've seen from the historical data. And that's the reasoning behind putting in the information that we're going to assume for the sensitivity cases.
Okay, table number 10. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you mind if I ask a question about the SELT, the adjustments to the SELT?
We focused on how do you shade
Okay.
peak energy demand. And the three questions, or two sub-questions we have
Okay,
on
do you have a question?
is,
Why don't you go ahead and ask your
do you
question?
take into account the building of compressed gas storage tanks along the pipeline route to be available, so you fill those during off-peak hours? And in the same fashion, you take a look at promoting alternative sources of energy which will reduce the peak demand for thermal, for example. If you put in alternatives to gas furnaces and things like that. And that is a complicated question, we think, because it anticipates technological changes, price reductions, which will actually affect the price of gas in the future as the demand for gas goes down and the gas cost infrastructure is spread out over fewer people in their gas region.
I think that's a topic for our feasibility analysis. So topic for the afternoon.
So if you have another question just on what we were presenting this morning.
Just a follow-up on that.
No, I'm not going to follow up on that because we're getting into that this afternoon. So if you have another question just on what we heard this morning, I'll take that and think about it. I'll go to the next table. I know it's hard where one begins and one ends, but this afternoon we're going on all the resources that they took a look at, which we understand. They're all passing it to you.
My name is Matt D'Antonio with the New England States Committee on Electricity. I too wanted to talk a little bit about slide number 14 and the modeling objectives, the scope of the project. I understand that the study reserves the right to adjust the base case forecast based on well-publicized expertise. It's not entirely clear why one would do that in a sufficiency analysis. So if there's sufficiency of the gas pipeline capacity, and if the base case is supposed to evaluate sufficiency of the pipeline, but your load forecast is somewhat lower than the regional system operator, which considers capacity and dispatches and probably has a better indicator of what the regional power burn might be, why would you put a reduction to their load forecast in the base case? And I can understand it at 60 days.
So the changes that we would be making to the base case are for corrections or adjustments that are not restricted to lowering load. It's any correction or adjustment that is well-known, well-publicized, we feel like is something that has been, is something well-known in the industry, a correction to that forecast. Where there are such corrections, we want to include them in our base case.
Start in that corner and start
Hi, my name is James Gay from Representative Peter Pocock's office. We had a question regarding the peak event during the cold snap. Would that occur, say, would the peak event during the cold snap happen in the beginning of it, or the middle, or towards the end of the cold snap?
That's not something that we've determined yet. Basically, we're starting with a broad outline of what our winter peak event looks like and zooming in. And the details that I've given you are kind of our broad outline for that winter peak event. We're very much looking forward to getting people's feedback about this and to hear what are some other characteristics that people in the industry and other commenters are looking to see in a peak event, and then also, importantly, when we have a peak event, by whatever definition, what are the effects that you expect to see on the system? So we'd love to see that feedback from the people that work with this kind of data every day and from others that have experience in what kind of impacts you expect in such a cold snap.
And the other question we had was, what is the...
Hold on 1 second. One question per group, and then we'll go around.
Okay.
Trying to make this equitable as a big crowd.
Table 7.
Thank you. Peter Shannon with E&E also had a question about the cold snap. We discussed how it seems like it may be appropriate to start with the LDC forecast, which is based on heating demand, but wondered if there is any adjustment for the fact that that demand is based on contractual obligations, whereas the gas that's used by generators is basically whatever is left over on the system. So is it appropriate to use that long of a term for, we're mostly focusing on the electric sector here. And additionally, is there any probabilistic overlay of the likelihood of having a 12-day cold snap that'll be included, just in terms of trying to get at the issue of how much infrastructure do we need to build based on the likelihood of a worst-case scenario happening, a cold snap?
So to your first question, my first response to that would be that we're not just primarily focused on the electric sector. We're looking at both electric and gas, that both, and elements of both are included throughout our modeling. So I don't think that there's a dominant focus on the electric sector here. That yes, we should definitely keep track of the issues that you're describing, and we welcome comments and feedback on them. We have not yet made a final determination how that's going to play out in modeling. It's something that's still open, and we're looking for people's input to try to get it right. In terms of the probability of the cold snap, we're not investigating probabilities or uncertainties in terms of weighting probabilities or doing any kind of Monte Carlo analysis or trying to involve probabilities in the analysis. We're doing a scenario analysis, and we've set out these 8 scenarios. We're not setting probabilities that one or the other of these 8 is more probable than the other. We're just looking at these 8 scenarios. If this situation happened, what do we think would the outcomes of that be, and to compare that. It's not about those likelihoods.
But having said that, with regards to this study, when the LDCs do their analysis, when they pick their design date, there is a probability analysis that supports that. Not that we're going to incorporate that here, but it's kind of behind the scenes in their resource plans. And the cold snap is not really a probability analysis. In most cases, it's based on some historical actual period that saw that kind of extreme weather for whatever period of time that they chose.
Table 6.
John Carlton-Foss, Climate Action Citizens. At our table, we ended up in a rather extensive conversation about the limitations and delimitations of the study and the assumptions. And so the question is, how are you going to communicate what the limitations of the study are and interpret it? And will you work with an appropriate group of us to get that right, so it's understood by the audience?
Part of our mandate from MEOR is to include a section on caveats and limitations in the report. We want to make that as good as we possibly can so that it represents all of those limitations. And we welcome feedback on that through the comment process. It's something that you can flag specifically as being suggestions or comments on caveats to the report, and that'd be very helpful.
Dennis Eckloff, I'm a private citizen. I'm also a member of a couple of committees evaluating the pipeline. The major one is the Northeast Municipal Gas Pipeline Coalition. It represents about 10 towns in North Middlesex County. And the question I have, and it's one that I actually raised in the first meeting, I looked at the price sensitivities, and I think if you really look at them, all of them are all based on the assumption that we have a long-term, robust supply of gas from Marcellus, Utica, etc. None of them look at the possibility, which has been raised by some serious industry analysts, that we are looking at a gas bubble right now that could end very soon. And we are evaluating at this point how much gas we need against a price scenario which might prove to be way under what we see at the time, and that affects an awful lot of the things that you are analyzing, alternative energies, storage costs, etc. And I'm very concerned that this study will have a major shortcoming because of that price outlook.
Go ahead. Answer the question.
Thanks, and I know that DOER is still taking input into the gas prices, and so that's something that we're still bringing in input to. I want to give Leo a chance to talk through how these gas prices were determined, and then we'll be taking more feedback to say, given that, is this the right selection of gas prices?
Yeah, what we tried to do was to get some kind of band and sensitivity around prices, and use something where there's a modeling construct that's consistent with whatever the resource availability is and what supply and demand based on that availability to drive prices to be. If you have studies that indicate that, in fact, this is a gas bubble and we do expect to see declining resources over time, it indicates what the prices would be under that scenario. I'd love to see it, and we can evaluate it. What we tried to do, however, is look at the DOE annual energy outlook, and they specifically identified that the uncertainty in their forecast is the resource base. And for that reason, we chose, as the price alternative scenarios, the high gas and oil resource base and the low gas and oil resource base, for exactly the reason that you mentioned. I don't think their assumptions are as extremes as the one that you're propounding here, but like I say, if you have something that gives us some data that we can use, that would be helpful.
I also wanted to just mention quickly, We did, I know the DOER did, and we at Synapse also did read through all of the comments. There was so much helpful information in there, a lot of good resources that we passed to the various people at Synapse that were working on a particular issue, which were great. And DOER gave us comments that they wanted to have us address. And so we did work and go through all of the comments, and we're hoping to see more great comments in this next period. I think it was particularly helpful in comments that I saw when they were flagged by topic, so that you know what the topics are that were organized here in terms of our slide deck. To see comments that are then flagged by that helps us sort them into, okay, here are the various comments that are about the winter peak event or whatever it is, but to flag out those comments and with a subject heading, a topic heading, makes it a lot easier for us to absorb them.
And we'll circle back to the comments at the end. We've got two more groups that haven't asked a question yet.
Hi, Michael Burnett from No Fossil Fuel. Our question is actually about this side as well, the natural gas price sensitivity. We want to know what the assumptions were to bring the mid and the high point price at 2018 the same, and then diverge. I guess maybe really describe the assumptions of the event that make that happen.
Yeah, I don't have all the details behind there right now, but I can't explain how that trajectory was developed. In the near term, through December 2015, it uses NYMEX futures prices, so Henry Hub price, from the middle of October or so, the closing price is the middle of October. So that's why in all three cases they're the same. We assume that was the trajectory. Then beyond that, we just use the trajectory, as I said, from the DOE, EIA, Annual Energy Outlook, and that supports, like I said, the reference case is kind of an expected outlook on gas and oil resources and the demand. It's also consistent with economic assumptions that drive those forecasts and the prices that result from that. The high price case is based on a low oil and gas resource case. As I mentioned in my last response, what DOE identified that there's a lot of uncertainty about what the gas resource base is going to be going forward. And what they wanted to do was test what's the impact on prices if we get a lower resource base than what was in the reference case. So that's what the high case is. And then the low case is the opposite. It's what if we have a high oil and gas resource base which drives the prices down. And
so nothing specific about
there's nothing specific. It's just the way the trajectory worked out. And it's probably assumptions based on when we expect certain fields, oil and gas fields, to be developed under those scenarios.
Let's take the last question from that.
Nancy Goodman, Environmental League of Massachusetts. I believe you said that you're shifting from using the RGGI price for carbon to another price, but I don't believe you said what that price was.
So we are still using the RGGI price in years through 2020. So the price series that we're going to use as an allowance price in the electric sector, I'll say first, for those of you that are familiar with it, just to give you a point of reference, that it's the same one that's used in a base case of AESC 2013. For those of you that aren't familiar with that, then what it is from 2015 through 2020, it's the RGGI projection. So it's the official RGGI price projection. That's as far out as those price projections go. And so if we just used the RGGI forecast, then that would be the assumption that it remained flat in real terms, that it became constant in real terms after 2020. Instead, we're using different forecasts, switching the forecasts in 2020 to use what we call the Synapse forecast. And that's based on our most recent Synapse CO2 price forecast, which is a report that we put out every couple of years. The most recent one is 2014, early 2014, right? And to use that price forecast, when we do those price forecasts, they're about federal price on carbon. And we're making projection, and we give low, medium, high. The one we're using here is the medium of what we expect to see in terms of the federal price on carbon in the future. When we think that will begin to occur, what we see those trajectories as moving at. And so we're switching over from the RGGI over to Federal One, which would subsume the RGGI. Since the Synapse Carbon Price Forecast and AESC were released, we've had the release of 111D Clean Power Plan. The Synapse forecast is not based on any one particular policy. It's looking out over a lot of different kinds of resources, looking out over a lot of different utility forecasts, over estimations of the cost of abatement in the electric sector, looking at a lot of different angles into what is meant by a price on CO2. And in that, we are not necessarily assuming that it would be a cap and trade or other allowance mechanism. It's meant to be a broad assumption of how CO2 federal regulation would change the costs to generators that they were bidding into ISO New England. And so we feel that since there is not yet analysis about the specific impacts of 111D, that the Synapse forecast is encompassing of effects of 111D, as is the concept that as a RGGI price would increase over time after 2020 if New England or Massachusetts mechanism for complying with 111D is through RGGI, then it seems likely that that would entail some tightening of the RGGI caps over time and therefore a price increase. So we're trying to incorporate all those things using this single price forecast.
So for people who haven't seen it, I think she was asking, you said before it was flat, so is this much above flat, decreasing? Can you characterize what?
It rises over time in real terms, and I don't have off the head how many percent to give you. We can make that available. Somebody's showing me a Synapse carbon price. Is that from ASC or from?
ASC. It's $40.
Oh, goes out to $40 in 2030. I think it's in 2020 it should be $10, right? That's where RGGI gets to in 2020. So our mid forecast going out to 2030, looking at a graph here that shows it at $40.
Thank you. Okay, so we managed to get all the way around the room in the half an hour that we had for 2 questions, but that's fine. So we have another half an hour before lunch. So I'd like to open it up now for any individual either questions or comments. But let's leave the LNG and energy efficiency and renewables to this afternoon when we have all of that before us, and let's talk about the modeling for this morning. So we'll go around, we have a whole half hour. Here, and then James, and you. Peter,
Ariel Elan from Montague. You're talking quite a bit about pricing in carbon, meaning carbon dioxide. My concern, comment, and urging to you is that even though applicable law does not at this point require it, it is essential to look at the full cycle of methane generated in the extraction, transportation, production, and use of natural gas, as well as oil, as well as coal. Because the methane molecule, every time it escapes into the atmosphere, is 86 times as powerful a greenhouse gas molecule over a 20-year lifespan as a CO2 molecule. So even though the laws and the proposed carbon tax do not allow for this right now, it is a physical reality that we're all living with. And the projected climate damage of not controlling methane is, it's not endurable.
So, do you want me to respond to comments, or we're just taking comments?
If there's something that you want to, if there's something that you want to respond to, or there's an implicit question, then go ahead. But you don't have to respond to every comment.
Okay, so I wanted to say that what you're saying is accurate in terms of the modeling plan, that we are not looking at methane. We're just looking at CO2 as we observe. And that's what has been requested by DOER, and I think that Farhad or somebody else from DOER can comment on that. And I think you've also put your finger on what some of the issues are in terms of that it's about what is and isn't part of current state law in terms of what we're including in our climate planning. Farhad, did you want to comment on that?
Basically, we have to limit the study to what we could do during the short span of time that we have, and to analyze the emissions for methane beyond what is natural gas that's being used in Massachusetts was not something that we thought we could incorporate into the scope of this study at this point.
James Daly, Northeast Utilities. I'm still not quite clear on how you're modeling the peak demand. Gas distribution companies are required by regulation in Massachusetts to study a peak season. In other words, it's the coldest season in 33 years, I think is the standard. So they're looking at a design cold season, it's called. So quite cold. And then on top of that, they're required to test the resilience of the supply by dropping in a peak. Now you've defined the peak here in one way, which seems to be 12 days or something like that. So the point about dropping in a peak on top of the design cold is that you're stressing the system to the degree that it could be. Because not every day, in a design season, not every day is a peak cold day. It averages out to that. But the point is that your resources, by the time you get into, say, January, are stressed in a design cold season, and then you drop in a design peak on top of that, which is really the test we have to withstand in the gas LDCs. Is that what you're doing here? It's not clear whether you're dropping that peak into a design cold or an average cold winter. That's the question.
And I have to say that it's still a work in progress and something that we're looking to hear these kind of comments on. Saying, what is the best way to do this? What is the way that meshes best with what LDCs are doing? What's going to give us the best scenario for a constraint on the gas system that's an appropriate level of constraint to be looking at. So we're still looking for feedback, and there isn't a definitive answer yet.
Just a follow-up comment on that. Given that that's the standard that the gas LDCs have to adopt, wouldn't it make sense for you to adopt those here rather than reinventing a standard and then looking at, because we're really looking at what's left over from the gas LDC demand to what's available for power generation. So it would be appropriate to adopt that standard. And I think you need to do that soon to get your modeling right.
You had Peter and go ahead quickly on the phone.
Jim Stanton from National Parade. I agree with James Daly. I'm trying to understand when you determine the efficiency on the peak hour, how do you relate that to the annual requirement and annual cost? I'd like to understand a little more how that's going to be done.
We're modeling both peak and annual, so both things are part of the modeling. I'm not sure if that was the answer to your question.
Well, here's the example. Let's assume you define efficiency to the hour related to efficiency of pipeline capacity. I'm trying to understand when you take that efficient hour or 12 hours, how does that relate to an annual cost, an annual requirement? That's what I'm trying to understand.
And in terms of how to incorporate our constraint periods into our annual modeling, that's something that we're still at work on. We are modeling both things, and we're looking for the most appropriate way to connect the two.
Peter Shannon again with E&E. Wondering, this may actually be a question for the distribution companies. If their projections are going to be the basis for the peak demand, I'm wondering if it's publicly available, if they'd be willing to share, what is the basis? Is this an event that happened last year? Is this an event that happened 10 years ago? Just given that we have a warming trend in the region, might be relevant. And then the question is, in relation to the gas price forecasts, there was some specific input on other sources rather than just the EIA, AEO forecasts that specifically address the impacts of gas exports. So this is a 2012 EIA study that shows if you export to a fairly significant level on a near-term time frame, that you have prices that are pretty significantly above the high price gas forecast there. So I'm just wondering if you could respond to why those weren't included, or if how you see the impact of exports being reflected in the study, because it's not dedicated in the high price there, which just has to do with the availability of the resource.
You're right, it's not. My understanding is that MEOR is still taking comments about the gas prices. So we've only just gotten to them. Here's our proposed gas prices and why they are as we're describing today. So it's still something that's under consideration. We are not able to do an additional sensitivity on exports, which would be one way to address it. So it's something that needs to, the various concerns about what's an appropriate high gas price need to somehow be absorbed into a single high gas price.
Larry Cretion with Mass Energy Consumers Alliance. My concern relates to slide 23, about the heat rate. You indicate that your analysis for today, I guess the numbers you've run, relates to the heat rate associated with the generator that is marginal during the peak hours of the year. And that's 12 million BTUs per megawatt hour. And that, to me, seems to be to the point of this whole exercise, which is trying to figure out how we're going to handle that moment. So an alternative heat rate option would be looking at the monthly average applied by Exelon, which is like 2/3 of that. It's 8.4 BTUs per megawatt hour. So just to clarify, were you leaning towards changing that to the lower one in your next iteration of work here, or are you going to stay with the one that's the peak hours of the year?
We're seeking feedback on that, and to be more clear, perhaps, than I was in that slide, this was a comment about annual energy use. So in our way of estimating for each of the alternative resources, what their annual energy use is, what on an annual basis is being displaced in terms of gas. That's where we were thinking about using a different heat rate than what you're going to see today. So there may also be an appropriate role for the higher heat rate in looking at gas displacement on peak.
Okay. You're not comment on that? Okay. That seems to be, that latter clarification you made seems to be appropriate. I think we do want to measure impacts annually. We want to measure the cost. We want to measure emissions. But I think the object of the game, quite frankly, for a lot of us is to try to figure out the least cost way of dealing with the peak moments. And that if you were to use the monthly average when you're trying to assess the value of something that can displace gas on a January cold night, I think that would be a mistake. So I hope you will continue to use the peak hour rate of 12 million BTUs per hour on that basis. Can I just supplement that? We are using the market analytics model, electric power sector model, and that electric power sector model has a lot of detail on the heat rates, the marginal heat rates of all of the different units in New England. So to the extent that we're looking at this 6 p.m. winter peak day, the model is capturing the fact that the last set of capacity segments are the generating resources that are a relatively higher heat rate, 12, perhaps higher than 12. Certainly some of the jet engines, for example, are maybe higher than 12. The model will capture that for what's going on in the electric power sector at that winter peak hour. So.
Yes, absolutely. And so this issue is about the feasibility analysis and making a determination about what resources will or won't be included in the load demand case, which doesn't pass through the electric model. And so there we need to, and we'll discuss this a lot more in the afternoon about how those determinations could be made.
Tim Burning from National Grid. Let's probably go to still the confusion, I think, on the reference price for the fuel. And reason we're having a lot of discussion is, you go back to 2012, the entire wholesale ISO New England market, about $5 billion energy capacity, everything. First quarter of 2014 alone, we've already basically hit that number. And I think, as I said, primarily, we all know, primarily it's due to those constrained pipelines causing price spikes and short supply on winter peak days. But we've talked about the reference in the couple. Is your reference too high or low, your average price? It's not clear to me whether your analysis and your model is going to spike those prices several times in the winter, so it properly reflects the cost that wouldn't show up in the average reference price assumed all year. And also the higher emissions we've seen past winter, that when that happens, the gas price went so high that not only because of a lack of supply, but because of price alone, oil units even more expensive, or oil units have been in merit at similar prices and actually displacing gas, so your emissions would actually go higher in those events. So that's my question: is the model appropriately capturing those spikes versus using an average reference price?
So a couple answers in there. One is that we are looking at variations in gas price over time. We're not looking at one gas price for a year. We're going to bring into it the variations in gas price over time, and also in terms of emissions and emissions effects. When we do our electric dispatch modeling, it's looking at specific units being on or off operation and which emissions that those specific units generate. So it's capturing those effects that you're describing. However, all of the 8 scenarios that we are modeling are going to be scenarios in which the situation of extreme constraint has been solved. We are not modeling a scenario in which there is a failure to provide demand, or in which there are extreme price spikes. In all of our scenarios, we are going to add resources to the system until we reach a point where there is a balance between capacity and demand. So that may be through adding the alternative resources that we're discussing for the low demand. It may be, both in the base case and the low demand case, if we get to the sort of preliminary outcomes of our model and find that capacity and demand are not in balance with each other, then, and I'll talk about this later in the afternoon, then we will add, it may be pipeline capacity, it may be LNG injection, it may be some of the resources that didn't make it in originally into the feasibility analysis, if they have particular effects on winter peak events. But each one of the 8 scenarios will achieve a balance between capacity and demand.
And Antonio from NESCO again. My question is about slide 22. These are the Canadian transmission sensitivity kind of assumptions here. 2 data points. On the far right column, the peak hour gas savings, 10,800 units. I think that's using your assumed 12,000 heat rate. I think that's a 75% capacity factor. I mean, I think the previous slides that you were going to assume 100% availability in the peak hour. So I know that you're going to be relooking at all those numbers, but I think if you want to check your capacity factor here, if you're incremental stuff, we will look at that. And my real question is, can you help us understand your annual net levelized cost assumption there? I think if you're going to assume 100% deliverability in the peak hour of the winter, you might be implicitly assuming a contract for firm delivery, and if so, is that embedded within your $100 a megawatt hour? Basically, can you unpack that levelized cost of $100 a megawatt hour?
I can't unpack that cost now. I'm sorry, because I haven't got that exactly how we got to that. So let's just put that off to the side, then we'll get that.
And in terms of, is there not an assumption that there's...
You guys need to speak to the mic.
Sorry, can you just address the assumption about purchasing capacity?
About what?
The firm capacity.
Oh, yeah, generally we're not making an assumption.
I know you don't like it, but you need to.
Generally, we're not making an assumption that these resources in these sensitivity cases would be providing firm capacity. What you see there, that annual net levelized cost, I believe reflects a combination of the cost of the line and the cost of profile of energy associated with the line.
Yeah, so does that mean that an annual capacity factor of 67%, a peak day capacity factor of 75%, and a peak hour of 100% is supposed to reflect an economic basis for injecting the power?
Yes, in short.
Thanks.
And that's based in part on what we've seen from the existing lines, and in part based on the information about what the new lines would be.
Hold on.
Ken Wall from Mass Sierra Club. assumption do you make about how peak event changes over time as either technology changes or other resources come online? Does the peak event demand change over time in your scenarios?
Yes, it will. So it will change, and the resources that are included in the load demand scenario in particular will have load, some of them anyway, will have load impacts, and so that would change what were the peak requirements. So too, it would change in the base case, but in different ways. There we are considering the expected change in load over time, but it's the expected change.
Lenny Johnson with the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust. In regard to Massachusetts demand scenarios, because my question is whether both the base case and the low demand case are consistent with GWSA compliance.
Whether or not each scenario is GWSA compliant will be an outcome of the study. So for each scenario, and of course we'd have to make assumptions about what was going on in the other sectors. We can make a determination about whether or not that scenario is or is not GWSA compliant. So there is not an initial assumption that we're organizing each of these scenarios to be GWSA compliant. Rather, we're running the scenarios and then asking the question, were they GWSA?
So in other words, some of the scenarios may not be consistent with basically Massachusetts policy.
Some of them may not be consistent with the Massachusetts law, which is different than being consistent with our existing policies.
Okay, so we've got table 11, and then Eric, are you back?
Rich Cowan, a private citizen from Drake, Mass, with the Drake Stop Pipeline Group. And this is a question on our table we wanted to ask. The self-forecast is referred to, I think Liz said that if there's a specific, well-published or known critique of that forecast, it will be included. So beyond that, I wanted to know if you could talk about the specific numbers in the self-forecast that I'm looking at. This is the May document that was produced. Have some reductions in output that don't seem to make logical sense. For example, it assumes that wind is going to ramp up by 2017 to 418 megawatts, and then in 2018, or winter 2017, it's going to drop from 418 to 248, for example, and then stay there constant. There's also nuclear. It assumes nuclear last winter and nuclear in 23-24 are pretty much the same amount of power we generated from nuclear. And then in the hydro pump storage, the number for this last winter was 1607. It's assuming 769 for this coming winter, even though I know that pump storage is part of an enhanced reliability. So these are just a few examples. But are you going to publish your numbers of what you're going to assume for every year until 2023-24 for all of those ISO categories of generation?
So to be clear, the numbers that we take from SELF are for load. They're not for the generation. So the information that we're taking from SELF is solely the generation, is solely the load, and other information published by ISO New England is not the basis of our base case.
So do you have is your study including base numbers for generation as well? And do you know where those are coming from?
So in terms of the resource mix, so it's basically the capacity mix, what's available to run, because the model determines what actually runs. So for that, our basis is in a study that we did last year for DOER, where our goal of one of our runs, the one that we're using, is to match as closely as possible all of the New England policies that would impact on the electric sector. So all of our Green Communities Act policies and all of the various states' renewable portfolio standards to figure out what resource mix would be necessary in order to match and comply with those various policies. And to that, we're examining it, we're seeing are there any areas that, looking at it today, we want to do an update or a change.
Thanks, Eric Winkler from ISO New England. Liz, great work, and the ISO supports the efforts that are being taken by the state to study this more. I wanted to go a little bit back to the CELT. To the extent that Synapse is going to assume, other than the CELT as the base case load forecast, to what extent are the adjustments that are made balanced with respect to a higher or lower load? And also, to what extent do those adjustments may impact the alternative resources? In other words, if there's an adjustment that relates to, say, solar or energy efficiency, is that going to be managed on the alternative side, or could it be managed on the alternative resource side rather than adjusting the base case?
So the adjustments, we haven't determined yet what adjustments we're going to use. We will, to the extent that we can make that available when we do. We're not looking for a broad range of adjustments to make, just things that we know there have been critiques of the CELT, particularly DG and EE. We're looking at to say, does the most recent CELT need such an adjustment or doesn't it? Because there have been updates in both of those areas. So in terms of if we make an adjustment to load, then yes, that has an impact on what the renewables requirements are, for example, in the renewable portfolio standard. And absolutely, we're tracking that across to make sure that those things are consistent with each other. These kind of adjustments that we're talking about are just to have CELT match existing policy, which is what is part of the base case. And so I don't see it as an issue for the alternative resources or the low demand case. That's the entire purpose of it, is to make sure that CELT is representing existing policy.
So just can I follow up on that? Because the CELT currently incorporates policy. The energy efficiency forecast that the ISO has been conducting for the last 3 years accounts for roughly 205, 210 megawatts of energy efficiency in New England per year for 10 years. And the DG Forecasting Working Group also has developed a DG forecast in the long-range transmission planning that accounts for certainly the 1,600 megawatts of nameplate for Massachusetts policy. So are you talking about something beyond that?
We appreciate that the CELT makes every effort to include existing policy, but we're going to be doing our own cross-check together with information that's given to us by DOER to determine our assessment of is CELT matching existing policy.
We're going to go back and forth between the front and the back. Jerry, go back.
Jerry Oppenheimer from the Low-Income Network. So another question about resources. In the base case, I'm curious to know what the assumptions are for energy efficiency, and then we just answered that. But also LNG and oil, and in the incremental transmission, are you assuming anything about wind?
Is the second part about the
incremental
sensitivity?
transmission sensitivity? Are you assuming anything about wind?
So my voice is going. Sorry, everybody. So in the Canadian transmission sensitivity, our assumption is that the power that would come into New England is system power. So it's not a direct line to hydro, it's system power from Quebec. And so that's how we're looking at it. We have looked at how wind resources are expected to change in Canada over this period in terms of our feasibility assessment of what happens if you put in these two lines. So we do have that in mind. We're looking at the various changes to the HQ system to see whether there's going to be enough capacity there to serve these lines and what it would mean. And take me back to your question before that.
Basic case assumptions about LNG and oil.
We have been working at a feverish pace to try to provide these low demand assumptions, and so yes, the low demand assumptions are all based on being an increment above the base case, but we've not yet had the chance to lay out tables and figures that describe the base case and give that information. In terms of oil and LNG usage, it's something that we're still researching to say what are the best assumptions about LNG in the base case. Maybe, Leo, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I can't really add anything other than we're still looking at what those numbers need to be.
Okay, so that's different.
As I mentioned earlier, we are trying to capture all of the LNG capacity and its utilization rates to be able to incorporate that, especially with regards to sensitivity analysis.
So you're going to do some trade-off between LNG and oil? Or how are you going to handle it?
Still a work in progress, and we're happy to hear people's comments on what they consider a good and sensible way to do that.
I do have a question. I actually have two questions, but I think that we can together. And it's about the same thing. It's about the incremental Canadian transmission. My first question is on the sensitivity. We're talking about 2,400 megawatts to 1,200 megawatt lines. Will the study illustrate incremental sensitivity per line, or will it just assume that 2030 will have 2,400 megawatts? And what I'm after is, will we be able to see the incremental sensitivity among the mix of other resources that will be discussed this afternoon?
So our assumption is that the first line could come online by 2018 and the second line by 2022. For the feasibility analysis that we're going to show here doesn't take into account that sensitivity. We're looking at for the base case feasibility analysis as a place to start and then to demonstrate what we're doing with feasibility analysis. So that's not something that one relates to the other. In terms of our modeling, we've had the feedback from DOER that they would like to, whatever extent possible, especially for the early years, see modeling on an annual basis. That is how our electric model works on an annual basis, and our gas model is still in design, but we understand that that's a priority.
Thanks. Can I ask one second question? And I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm having a collision with the acquisition on the phone. My second question is a follow-up about the calculations for the cost of incremental hydro. I think you said that you can't unpack that now. Will that be unpacked as part of the next step of the process, so we'll be able to understand, is it the range of potential projects that we're looking at, and what's going into that?
Yes, we can. The reason I can't unpack it now is I was focused, when I looked at this stuff before today, I wasn't focused on that particular number. I was looking more carefully at the peak hour gas savings and the energy production numbers and capacity numbers. It's just not rushed to be prepared today.
But Bob, could you talk in general terms about where the cost numbers came from?
Yeah, in general terms, there's a number of estimates out there for the different possible lines coming down from Canada. So at this point, we're using public sources to try to get a handle on what might these lines cost, and we realize there's quite a bit of a range. On the energy side of it, I think it's a little bit more straightforward, getting a sense of what the cost or the price being paid to any energy that flows over the line, what those lines would look like. And I think that's based in part on what we see historically for prices in New England for interchange energy. And as I indicated, we're making no assumptions that that resource attracts firm capacity.
Stuart Ormsby with TransCanada. Earlier in the day, you mentioned that with respect to basis forecast, that's still a work in progress. Can you give us any kind of prelude on that in two respects? One is the possible sources that you're considering to use, and then two, the iterative effect based on the different sensitivities and scenarios.
I don't think we can give a preview at this time. It's something that we're still looking at data sources for and exploring what are some of our options, so we don't have something firm to share. In terms of the iterative effect, in part, with the analysis, as many people have observed, there is an endogeneity or an iterative effect problem with prices. And in part, and so please don't take this to be the entire answer, but in part, this is solved by the
modeling treatment that each of these scenarios has a solution to the constraint. In each of these scenarios, we're achieving balance between capacity and demand. So that solves some of the endogeneity problem.
So we're a bit over. I just want to see, is there one burning question from the phone? Okay. Obviously, we need to give Liz 45 minutes to recharge her voice if possible. But here's the drill for now. The lunch boxes are all lined up in here in room B, which is right. You can either go through this door or that door. You can eat in here, you can eat in B. There's 2 little rooms across the hall you can eat in. We'll get back together at 12:30 and we'll get into the feasibility analysis. I know there's still some questions in the room. You take a good look at the Synapse folks, except for Liz. You can go bug them during lunch and try and get your questions answered, okay? So, 12:30. We ordered at least a third issue for many of you, not necessarily for all, but what resource mix that we have here in Massachusetts. And I hope we can carry that on into the afternoon. We have the afternoon a little bit differently arranged, so let me just remind you, for those who we have a lot more slides on the feasibility analysis. We're going to look at every single resource. So what we're going to do is we've organized it a little bit differently. Liz is still with her tiny voice going to give the presentation. We're going to pause about 3/4 of the way through because there are a lot of slides. We'll pause after she shows you their sort of setup for each of the different resources. We'll take 15 minutes of questions. Then she'll show you the threshold and what the supply curves look like. Take another 15 minutes of questions, just whoever has a question. And then we will take a break. And after the break, we'll have you, at this point, meet in more stakeholder-oriented groups. I'll talk about those later here and in different rooms, in which you have a little bit more time to talk and think about actually providing some organized feedback. Okay? So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liz to walk through the feasibility analysis.
Thank you. I lost the clicker. So this afternoon, we're going to be going through the details of the feasibility analysis. I'm going to be talking around a cough drop to try to keep my voice going here for you. We will talk about, in general terms, how we are thinking through resource selection for the low energy demand case, what the specific design elements are of our feasibility analysis, how we're treating avoided costs when we're looking at feasibility, and then we're going to go through very briefly the resource assessments for a long list of different resources, treating each one very briefly. We're going to have a couple times to come around to getting into more details about them. We can't do every resource on the list in detail at this meeting, but we are interested in people's comments, and there is another way to give us comments as written comments too. I think at that point are taking a question break, and then we'll talk about the potential thresholds for economic feasibility, and bring it around to looking at our supply curves, the feasibility analysis results themselves. That's a second chance to look resource by resource, because the supply curves are made up of the resources. So just to keep in mind that we have both of those chances to look at each resource specifically. For resource selection, we have done a resource assessment, a resource analysis for 3 snapshot years. And those years are 2015, 2020, and 2030. We're looking at a broad definition of what alternative resources could be. And the assessment that we're making is in terms of what are the annual costs of that resource divided by the annual MMBTUs that it can provide as being our cost number, our cost metric. And then there's going to be another moment when we're looking at winter peak, which I'll explain in a moment. But for this first part of the feasibility analysis, what we're looking at is the annual energy contribution, the annual MMBTU of these resources. So when you see the supply curves later, those are the terms that they're going to be in. Annual cost divided by annual MMBTUs is the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is the annual MMBTUs. And I'll get into a little bit of how involved we will think about winter peak in resource allocation. So the resources will then be assessed as being either less or more expensive than an economic threshold. Of course, what threshold is chosen is very important. If the resources turn out to be, whatever set of resources turn out to be less expensive than that economic threshold, we will take those resources and add them into our base case to create our low demand case. For those resources that are more costly than the economic threshold that is chosen, then we're going to take a look at that set and say, are there any among this resource that have something special to offer to us at the constraint period during a winter peak event? And we'll come back around to looking at those too. And I'll explain that. Okay. And sorry that this is smaller than other days. There's a lot of steps in the process here. But this is another try at giving you a schematic of how the modeling process works.
Let's take a break. I just got a note that Mayor Menino just died. So.
Mayor Menino just died.
Let's take a few minutes.
All of you have had some experience with in the air, and hopefully you can think about that. And we'll just keep that in your heads, and we'll just pick up this point. Okay?
Thank you. So we're going to continue with the presentation. And the slide that I have up now is a more detailed schematic of modeling with a little bit of different focus and looking at different data and different decisions that need to be made, particularly with regards to feasibility of what kind of resources to include in the low demand scenario. So here we have feeding into our low demand case assumptions, and the assumptions are the generation resource mix, the electric and gas load. Feeding into that is our feasibility analysis, where we're looking at annual dollars divided by annual MMBTU. We're looking at the annual MMBTUs that whichever particular resource achieves. Those resources that are below the economic threshold are then included in the low demand case. We're also taking account there of what we assume to be the winter peak MMBTU savings, but not yet putting that into action in terms of how it's being used for assessment. The assessment here is on the annual basis. And on an annual basis, we are deciding which resources are technically and economically feasible and will be included in the low demand case. From there, we're running modeling on the base case assumptions and the low case assumptions. Of course, there's also sensitivities that overlay this. From both of these, we have modeling that gives us annual cost of emissions, and we also have modeling that gives us winter peak event analysis. And the winter peak event analysis is focusing on the balance, the comparison between capacity and demand. And we'll ask, when we look at that, is capacity greater than demand? If it is, then that scenario is a feasible scenario, and we present those results. If it is not, if it's the other way around, demand is greater than capacity, then we have another step that leads us back in a circle. So that is that we're going to review balancing measures. And when we review those balancing measures, which could be pipeline, it could be LNG injection, it could be some of the resources that were too expensive to make it into the low demand case, but when you look at them on a winter peak basis, may be warranted for additional consideration. And so we're bringing that back around. When we do that review and comparison to figure out which balancing measure or measures to use to balance the scenario, we'll be looking at that on an economic basis, which is the least expensive one to use. But there, we're going to be looking specifically at, given the gap that we have in our initial run of the scenario between capacity and demand, given that size of the gap, what are the different costs of those different resources? Because we know that resources have, depending on what it is, may have a minimum amount that's available that could affect what the cost is at different levels. And so the resource assessment then will be specific to the gap between capacity and demand. And may have a different answer as to what's the most economic resource to balance with, depending on if it's a very small gap or a very large gap. So the feasibility analysis that we're discussing today is about this step, looking at these annual values and deciding what resources, based on the fact that we consider them to be technically feasible and the fact that they fall beneath an economic threshold, we are including in the low demand case. We are also gathering, as part of that analysis, information about what we think their effect is going to be on the winter peak. It's not part of our judgment at this moment as to what goes into the low demand case. We're just gathering that information. If there's some resources that don't make it in, we can then say, okay, here are among those resources the ones that have an impact on the winter peak. Should we be considering them as being balancing measures? Are they something that you could use in the context of a balancing measure? And if so, we would then put them in and rerun the case. I think we're waiting until a break to do questions. Okay. This is an example supply curve, some clearer labeling, but basically what I showed before to get the idea across that each one of the blocks is a measure of one kind or another. It could be an efficiency measure, it could be a kind of renewables, it could be another kind of policy altogether. And for each one of those, we have worked to give our best estimation for each of those 3 snapshot years. What is a good forecast of annual dollars divided by annual MMBTU? to give a per MMBTU price to it, and then what do we think on an annual basis that resource can provide in MMBTUs. Where we're talking about electric resources, the way that we translate from megawatt hours into MMBTUs is by making an assumption of what is going to be displaced. And so we're looking at gas resources being displaced. That's where the heat rate becomes important in terms of displacement, and where I mentioned before that we've been using a peak rate for displacement, and we're considering instead that it might be more appropriate to use more of an annual average heat rate as that displacement for this annual consideration, and not everywhere in the analysis, just here. So when we come back to the actual supply curves at the end, we would also be drawing across them economically efficient threshold, and then we can see which of these resources are cheaper than that threshold. We would expect to put these resources into the low demand case. Those resources that are more expensive than the threshold we'll put aside for consideration of balancing agents. If they don't have an effect on winter peak, they're not going to be useful for balancing. But those of those that do have an impact on winter peak, we can put them aside and consider them at that time. All of the resources that we're looking at and doing feasibility analysis on, we're considering in terms of their net costs. So we look at the cost to have that resource, including capital, and operating costs, fuel, all of those costs, and then we look at what kind of savings do we have, what kind of benefits in the system do we have of whatever is displaced, whatever is not run or avoided. And when we are estimating avoided costs, we are looking at some specific details by resource. The next slide will show kind of how different resources have slightly different avoided costs depending on what's getting avoided. For the energy efficiency resources, we are using the avoided energy, avoided capacity, and TMD, transmission and distribution, from the AESE 2013 base case. AESE 2013, for those of you that are not familiar with it, the AESE, the Avoided Energy Supply Cost Study, it's a study that's done every couple of years in New England to determine what avoided costs are for the purposes of having a threshold for what is all cost-effective energy efficiency. So we are taking avoided costs from that study. For the energy efficiency resources only, we are also including in that the avoided cost of GWSA compliance. Avoided cost of GWSA compliance is coming from the current 1486 docket that many of you are familiar with. That's what that docket is about. If you're not, it's about what the appropriate value is for GWSA compliance. So that's where we're taking that information. For other resources that are not energy efficiency resources, we are using just the base case avoided costs from AESE 2013. We are not adding on to it the GWSA compliance cost. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have any environmental compliance in it, because AESE 2013 does include the allowance price assumptions that we discussed before, the RGGI forecast going to 2020, and then the increase after that of what we call the synapse forecast. So that is embedded in there. When we add on the avoided cost of GWSA compliance, we back out those other environmental costs and we replace them with the GWSA compliance costs, which are larger. So those are the assumptions that we're using there. When we do our final versions of these feasibility analyses, we will take into consideration the price of natural gas. What we've done for today is just using the reference natural gas price. When we want to do a feasibility analysis that's going to be used for the low natural gas sensitivity, we will put the low natural gas price in here in the avoided costs, and the same thing with the high. What we're showing you today is the reference case. This table is going through how some of the assumptions for different kinds of resources are a little bit different from one another. I don't want to go into any depth with this. It's very much into the weeds. This is more something that we're providing for people that have this particular issue in mind and want to know what we're using for avoided cost assumptions. But you can see that there are some kind of resources that may not have this as an avoided cost, and so we don't put it in, or maybe different on the electric side than the gas side. We're using a basic set of assumptions that we're trying to take the, is anybody that door pretty close? That we are trying to take the ASC 2013 work on avoided costs and apply it to our resources in the best way that we can. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to jump into going through each of the resources. And there's a lot of resources. We went through and did specific detailed resource assessments on 32, I think it is, resources in the end that ended up. So it's a lot to go through. What I want to do here is go through them very briefly. Like I said, we get another chance to look at them in the context of the supply curves themselves, where all of those resources appear. And then I know that there may be specific resources that people have questions about, and we have with us the team from Synapse that completed all of these resource assessments somehow in 3 weeks. That's represented at the table over here. You guys want to just go down the row and introduce yourselves, please?
Is this on? Okay, good. Thank you. Doug Hurley. Jeff Keith.
Matt Knight.
Jennifer Calais.
Joseph Daniel.
So we have not quite everybody that worked on it, there were more people, but somebody representing each of the resources that got analyzed that's here to speak to those details. But of course, there isn't time in one afternoon to get into the smallest details of each one of these resources. We're going to do our best to give an overview. Just to give a little bit more information about what you're going to see for each resource. First of all, what we're putting forward to be put into the supply curve is our assessment of what's technically feasible. Okay? And that is based on looking at all the publicly available resources that we had at our disposal. We made a judgment about, after making that review, here's what we think is technically feasible, regardless of price, just technically feasible in each of the snapshot years. Okay? That's what we're presenting. We then take those, put them in a supply curve, and put an economic threshold against it and ask the question, which of these will be economically feasible? Right? So we're not putting a first layer of asking whether they're economically feasible. It's just technically feasible. And the answer for what technically feasible means is going to be different for every resource. We're doing we have wonderful staff at Synapse that spends time every day working with exactly these kind of questions and was able to bring their expertise to bear on the question of what would be technically feasible in those years for Massachusetts. I've got a little summary feasibility table for each resource that I'm going to show to you. I wanted to explain that both there and also in the supply curves that, first of all, the resources that we're looking at are incremental to the base case. So we got whatever amount of that resource is in the base case, this is the amount more. We're not showing you the two things added together. Okay? This is just the increment above. Also, that's clear for 2015. When we show 2020, what we're looking at is what's the new increment since 2015. So it's the 2016 to 20 increment, also above base case. When we show you 2030, we're looking at what's the new increment after 2020. That's the 2021 to 2030 increment. Okay? So just to be clear, it's not cumulative in any way. There's different directions. They're all incremental to give you just the amount that's added. Here we go. The first resource that we have up here is small onshore wind. And these are the tables that I'm going to be showing you for each one of these resources. So let's just do a little introduction to the table so that you can keep your eye on some key information. We have the annual capacity factor, and I should say, this is a little summary table. We also have many more bits of detail about this. I know that, I'm not sure if this has been said yet today, but I believe that the plan is to release our memo that is about the feasibility analysis, that it'll either be released on Friday or Monday. On Monday, like you're saying, and that will include as part of it tables that have a lot more elements in them than this, that are describing each of the resources for each of the years, so you get a chance to look at that. But this is just a summary. We have the total potential capacity, incremental in each year, right? And the annual net levelized cost for the electric resources, we're showing it in dollars per megawatt hour because we know that that's how people are used to looking at it. We want you to be able to compare that to your knowledge base about it. The translation into what's displaced in terms of MMBTUs of natural gas. And here we have what we expect to see in terms of annual energy production. If we used a different heat rate, this is the number that would change. And then here we have expected peak hour savings, which is not being used at this stage of the feasibility analysis. It's just a marker for what we're seeing in terms of what to expect on peak. Okay? Here's a number. This is all just weeds. For those of you that aren't staring at numbers like this all day, keep your eye right here. Okay? So these numbers right here, that's going to be the height of our supply curve. Okay? So there'll be measures that are negative. They'll point downwards on the supply curve. In those, the benefits, which are the avoided costs, are greater than the costs of it. Okay? And there'll be ones that the costs of it are greater than the avoided costs. Those will be positive. The range that you're going to see here is from 8,000, so we're almost hitting that right here, to about negative 1,500. Okay? That's the range that you expect to see. And so 8,000 to negative 1,500, you should be able to look at these and get a feeling for how this resource is going to fit into a supply curve. Right? Certainly we can see that for 2015, small scale onshore wind is way, way up at the highest end of costs, and you expect to see that then on the far, far right of your supply curve. I also have on here very brief treatment of what the data sources were. Actually, for this one, it shouldn't have the second bullet point. My apologies for that. The second bullet point just applies to the larger wind resources. So you can see here that our analysis of that has been based on communications with developers. And in some cases, that's how we dug into it, where we weren't able to find public sources that gave us information about a specific resource. We made calls to people that were developing those resources to try to get an idea from them. Okay. Okay, here is a little bit bigger onshore wind. You can see the capacity factor is a little bit larger. The dollars per MMBTUs are smaller. Okay. And again, this is a resource that we got information about just through personal communications with industry sources because we weren't able to find publicly available reports that informed us on this. A little bit bigger, and I want to now point out this bullet point here, which is referring to the larger wind classes, that we are including in the costs of these larger wind classes transmission. Right? That if it's not something that is a DG, a distributed generation source, we expect to have to include transmission cost into it. Our understanding is that just in complying with existing RPSs, that the capacity to add new renewables to the system is largely, I want to say maxed out, but you're pushed against the limits of that just from the existing RPSs. If we're talking about going beyond that, then we need to start thinking about additional transmission resources, and we've included those costs here. For the rest of the wind resources, the data source is coming from NREL, from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. we do a lot of work with their data and with a model that they have, which is called REEDS. So, and here, once again, you can see for this one's a little bit different. So for 2015, we have a 0 megawatts. And you'll see that for a number of resources where it's our estimation that what's already planned for 2015 is what you can get. That you can't get, like starting today, and making an intention or a new policy to have additional resources for onshore wind of this size and class, that you would not be able to get any more online by 2015. So we put it in as a 0. And you'll see other resources like that where we just don't think it's feasible to bring it online by 2015. You can see again what the costs are. They're a little bit lower, positive costs in 2020 and 2030. And of course, for this larger, this is class 5, we have much higher capacity factors. These are the class 4 wind resources. And for these, our assumption is that you wouldn't be able to bring additional ones on until after 2020, coming from the same data resource. And you see similar range of costs and a little bit slightly lower capacity factor. These are our offshore wind assumptions. So again, coming from the same data source, a little bit higher annual capacity factor and somewhat higher costs. We don't anticipate the possibility that new offshore wind that isn't currently in planning that could be brought online by 2015, but there is still that possibility for 2020. Okay. The next group of resources are solar resources. The first one is residential, and here again you can see what the range of costs are and compare that to what you just saw for wind to give you an idea. And then when you see the supply curves, you'll see them all lined up in order by their costs. These data came for some of it up through 2020. These were data that was other work through MEOR. And then we used our own assumptions based on our understanding of the industry and how prices are changing through 2030. This is for commercial PV. And you can see that the prices are changing quite a lot over time. It's the same data sources that we're relying on, but the expectation for a little bit for capacity factor, but also in terms of what the costs are for the system are different for larger commercial systems. For utility scale PV, so this is not generally rooftop, this is larger PV installations, a little bit higher capacity factor. Again, you can see what the costs are that, and how they relate to wind and to the other PVs, and you'll be able to see that in the supply curve. All of the resources that we're seeing, with the exception I think of one in commercial PV, have been positive cost. And so as we move through our resources, you'll see that there are certain kinds of resources that we expect to have negative net costs as well. We just haven't gotten to this yet. This is a resource that there is an assumption about how much of already dammed resources in Massachusetts could be converted to electricity production that are not currently producing electricity. It's not about creating new dams or flooding new areas. It's taking existing dams that either have another purpose or are no longer utilized and getting them to produce electricity. And it's based on an EIA study that was in particular about how that works. And the cost came from a Ohio case study of doing kind of converting a dam site into that wasn't being used for electricity production into electricity production. You can see that for this resource, we actually have negative net costs because the avoiding costs are outweighing what the cost of implementation are. And there's not a whole lot available here for this resource, but it is something that comes at a low cost. Landfill gas has not a very high potential in terms of megawatt hours, but has a high capacity factor. Again, this is a resource that can be had for negative net costs. It's
it's capturing a resource that already exists, doesn't have those fuel costs to it, things like that. And this came from an EPA study in terms of what the potential is and then what the cost is. Anaerobic digestion, similar, that it's not a whole lot is available, but it's at a very high capacity factor, and we have negative net costs again for this resource for the same reason. It doesn't have its own fuel costs associated with it, we're capturing the resources there. Energy storage, so this would be incremental pumped hydro over what we already have in the region. And we did see potential for that based on research from DOE and from EPRI, that there is additional potential for pumped hydro in Massachusetts. The cost, however, on an annual basis is above 1,000. This is something that I would flag as a resource that might not make it in to the low demand case. Perhaps, we don't know what the threshold is yet, but would be an example of something it might be worthwhile to consider in balancing, right? Because it's something that is dispatchable and it could be helpful, it could be dispatched during a winter peak, something to consider for balancing. Energy storage from batteries. I'm not the one to try to explain exactly how this works, but if a giant battery installation, and we have the staff here that can explain that, you can see the costs are high on an annual basis. But again, this is something that could potentially be used in winter peak to affect. The numbers as they're put in here is a 2015 number of being able to have some of this large battery installation. It is available, and that could happen at a cost. And so this is actually the size of one of these large battery installations. One large battery installation is a 40 megawatt installation, and that's what we were seeing being able to put in by 2015. And then larger amounts going out to the future. The next group of resources are biomass resources, and biomass has 4 different classes associated with it in our analysis, and those are based on the fuel price. So each one of these classes has a different cost to get those fuels. I think the costs range from $3 to Jeff, can you refresh me? What are the cost range from $3 to $12 per MMBTU? So here we are with class 1, and we have a small amount of potential capacity with a high capacity factor, and the costs are in this lower range. We did not see any potential for adding class 1 biomass by 2015. It would come later. Here's class 2. Similar numbers. Here, the fuel costs with biomass itself are a little bit higher, and so the net costs are a little bit higher. Biomass class 3, the fuel costs are yet higher, and it gives, you can see in this column here, the annual net levelized costs going up as the fuel costs for biomass increase. And this is the last one, class 4, the most expensive biomass class, and of course have a higher annual levelized cost. We have 2 kinds of combined heat and power units. So this first one are very small units, 500 kilowatt units, as being sort of an exemplar of that. And we have the ability to add on a small amount of that by 2015 and larger amounts going out. And these are showing negative net cost. So the idea with combined heat and power is that we're capturing resources already being used for heat, and we're making sure that it's also capturing electricity production from that. And so that's why you're seeing the negative cost. It doesn't have its own new dedicated fuel use. It's rather piggybacking on another resource. These are larger combined heat and power resources. The example here is a 12.5 megawatt unit that we're using to get these costs. Here we don't see the potential for bringing any new on by 2015. It would have to be a little bit later. And again, we have negative costs exactly because it's modeled as piggybacking off of another use for that energy.
the combined heat and power assumptions come from a report from ICF that was about these kind of additional CHP opportunities in the United States. Okay. So we've made it to electric energy efficiency, and as I'm sure you know, we have a couple different classes of that as well. So for energy efficiency, for electric energy efficiency, we took two things and put them together, and unfortunately I only got one of them into the notes here. The first one is a high case from this Lawrence Berkeley National study that it's their high case, and in it they were a couple years ago, or last year, modeling what would all cost-effective energy look like. So we had all of our all cost-effective energy. That's how they defined their high case. And so that was based on their assumptions about what all cost-effective energy was. On top of that, we add additional standards. And those additional standards and measures come from an ACEEE study that was also released recently, and we can get that citation up here. I apologize for not having it on the slide. We're looking at their scenario of adding additional standards going out into the future. They had a total possible for that, and we took 50% of it happening by 2020 of what they saw as being a total possible gain in efficiency from standards and measures. And then we keep that flat at that level after 2020, after achieving that 50%. So that's what you see as what we put into the residential. In terms of it being all of the energy efficiency that is technically possible, I'm not sure that we are capturing that. That's something that we're flagging as an issue for the group. We're not finding a study for Massachusetts or something where we could transfer the results into Massachusetts that shows us a very high usage of energy efficiency, a very high investment of energy efficiency. The high scenario from LBNL is actually not very high. And that's something that we could get into a little bit more in questions. It's slightly higher than the base case, but not by a lot. We added those additional standards on top of it. But I think it's a question that remains of, is there a good source out there that we don't know of to be able to say, here's the amount that is technically possible. Separating out the idea of economic feasibility is a question that we ask after. So you can see that the costs are negative, that with the avoided costs, it's the avoided costs outweigh what the costs are of implementation. This is the commercial and industrial. Again, you see large negative costs for these measures. And we also have a category that is called low income in Massachusetts, and these are measures that have been specifically designed to provide energy efficiency to low income households. And we generally find that those are expected to cost more, in part because the incentive structure is engaged to be able to bring in low income families and make that possible for them. So you see that as being a positive net cost here, where if the only decision point that we have about whether or not to do these measures is cost, then it would probably be the case that we wouldn't do the existing amount either, that there's another policy reason that the low-income measures are put in. Electric demand response. So we're looking at what additional electric demand response could be brought on in addition to the base case. We find the net costs are pretty high. There's a pretty large potential capacity to it. We base that on data from FCM auctions. If you want to dig into this, we have Doug Hurley here to be able to address those questions in the question period in terms of what assumptions we're making and how this fits into also what we're thinking about winter peak. The winter reliability program. So this is about
The base case includes the winter reliability program as it stands today. This is about extending the winter reliability program out into the future. And we did find some potential for that in 2020 and 2030. And again, when we come around, if this is something that people want to understand better, we'll get Doug to speak to that in the question period to explain a little bit more about how this works in ISO New England and what it would mean to extend it. And then also to think about what this means on a peak basis. Yeah, there we go. So heat pumps, we've got two kinds. This is the air source heat pumps. We based our analysis on a couple of different sources, including a study from Navigant. And you can see that there are positive costs to it in net basis, but they're relatively small compared to the range of up to 8,000 that we're talking about. Here, we just moved from the electric side over into the gas side. So the tables are going to look a little different. I left it in the same format so that we can follow it easily, but some of these things are not really appropriate to talking about gas measures. So we really start here. We get the annual energy production, we get the annual levelized cost, and then the peak hour, expected peak hour gas savings. And then for these measures, you're going to see these three columns as blank, because there is no electric side to it. Similarly, here are the ground source heat pumps. You know, we're figuring out what we see as being the potential ramp up of having these kind of units over and above what's already expected, and then showing the relatively low annual net levelized costs. Solar hot water. So these are solar systems that are designed to heat water rather than to generate electricity. Again, there's a annual energy production that's expected from that. We base the information on this one from making phone calls and talking to different vendors of these kind of systems to try to get an idea of how prices are expected to change in the future and how quickly it could roll out. You can see that the costs in our large range are relatively low. Thermal biomass. So thermal biomass is part of a set of resources that is in the Massachusetts Climate Plan and is considered in a large study by Navigant as being part of renewable thermal resources. And so part of the analysis here is coming from that, what that Navigant study was saying would be possible to roll out into the future. We made some changes to it at Synapse. The study is a couple, or at least 1 year out of date now. So their study is about the total amount of all the renewable thermals, so including that includes our very expensive heat pumps that we have in here. But in total, in terms of the number of units that you can roll out, we're differing from what people call the CART study. We're differing here. One, in that they saw a large rollout by 2015. Our assessment is that at this point in 2014, it's no longer possible to have such a large rollout for 2015, and we've scaled that back considerably. And then also, we put in approximately the same amount as them for the 2020, but for the 2030, the amount of total renewable thermal that's considered feasible in the CART study was so large in scale that we felt we would not be able to represent it on our supply curves because it would swamp all of the rest of the measures. It's just very, very large is what their assumption is. And when you compare it to all of our other measures, it's as large again as all of them. So what we've done is curtail it. We did a doubling of the incremental amount for 2020. We put a doubling of that in for 2030 just so we can represent it. But we acknowledge that there has been this study that showed additional potential for the use of this resource. Okay, gas energy efficiency. Again, our gas energy efficiency numbers are coming from the LD&L high case in this study. What they were looking at was their assessment of all cost-effective energy efficiency, and
so it's coming from their assessment of that. Again, we are still interested to find a credible resource that gives a technical feasibility assessment for Massachusetts of how much could be entered in. LBNO's high case includes this economic variable to it. It's saying how much is all cost effective, how much is economic given some all cost effective threshold. So it's not a complete technically feasible assessment, and we just haven't been able to find another source that gives a technical assessment for Massachusetts. You can see here that this is for residential, and we have low annual net levelized costs. This is the commercial and industrial. Here they're slightly negative. And finally, here's the low income. It's a little bit higher and positive. So this is the full set. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan so that we can take questions. I know that was a really quick run through a very large number of resources. So we're interested in digging in as much as we can.
So we're going to take 10 to 15 minutes of clarifying questions. Any time later to get feedback and comments. This is for clarifying questions, so when we set you loose, you will have some idea. So, get that other than that. Let's start over. First quick question, I'll pass it back.
Thanks. This is Ben D'Antonio from Mesco. Can we go back a couple of slides to the gas efficiency?
Yeah.
So if you include both the residential, commercial, industrial, and the low income, on the peak hour, is there really a BCF and a half of gas efficiency available?
If we include all three of them, you mean?
But yeah, that's 700 MMCF right there.
So, Jen, do you want to take that?
I can take a look at it again. I can take another look at it. A colleague of mine helped me to basically calculate the factor that would convert from annual gas savings into the peak hour. And so he used so what the calculation was, what the ratio was essentially 1/21% of 8760.
Okay, but for just eyeballing, if your annual is 1,300 and 1 hour of it is 700.
Yeah, that does look
If there's a
exact.
BCF and a half of gas efficiency out there, we should be solving it.
We'll double check it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like some clarification on the storage calculations. I mean, to me, I don't understand the logic of calculating annual numbers for storage when storage is really designed to handle peak loads. And so I don't understand the calculations and how you're going to evaluate storage options to cover peak loads as an alternative to having more pipeline capacity, for example, that exists all year long. Secondly, I didn't see anything there for increases in the storage of LNG for peak loads. It's already a factor. We have some already. I didn't see that in the numbers.
That's right. So, in terms of our storage resources, the ones that we're including in here are just the electric storage, and so those are the pumped hydro and the battery storage, and we're considering them on annual terms. It may be that they are higher than an economic feasibility test, and they wouldn't go in a first round. In that case, all of the resources that are not included as being less expensive than our economic feasibility will be reconsidered in terms of being balancers. And so at that time, we will look at them in terms of their value on peak. But that's not what we're describing here. We're just looking at what is considered to be technically and economically feasible on an annual basis as part of what we're going to include in our low demand scenario.
Still don't understand how your annual numbers for peak shaving
Do you want to, Jeff or Joe, do you want to address how we calculated those on an annual basis for storage?
Well, I can talk about how we calculated them, but I think that his point is just that it's not appropriate to, I think his point sort of stands. Why are we considering gas storage?
So I can't speak for the gas storage, but for electric storage, what we wanted to do was compare all the resources on an equal basis. So it meant levelizing the costs over the annual energy production. And then for the avoided costs, we did account for the fact that a pumped hydro station or battery station is going to be getting tremendous capacity value, avoided capacity value, and that helped drive down those costs. So we did try to encapsulate as much as we could the value at peak that batteries would be providing. So hopefully that adds some clarification.
So the last question was about gas storage.
So for gas storage, there are still measures that we plan to include in that last balancing piece that we have not yet included in feasibility analysis. So gas storage is something that would come into the balancing analysis.
Eric?
Thanks. This is a great representation of the resources you're considering. I appreciate you presenting them. I have two items, if I could, Jonathan. One is on the cost savings for T&D for DG seems a little bit. Well, let me just say this: if it's net metered, there's a D, right? There's a cost associated with that. So when you factor that cost savings, you have to account for what's net metered, because when it pushes back through the distribution system, there's a cost. And then just a clarifying question for folks maybe didn't catch this. I'm not clear. The total capacity that's listed in all these, this is the nameplate, and then you're applying a capacity factor times a heat rate to come up with the annual energy production, and that will feed back into the annual net levelized cost. And the heat rate is 12 for these calculations?
For these calculations, it was 12, yes.
It was for these calculations. Okay, because I did want to just sort of inform you, because I had one of my analysts look this up this morning, was that the annual heat rate for 2012 was about 7.56, I think. So when these numbers will all change relatively if you go to a different heat rate. So that's it won't necessarily change where they are relative to one another, but that's a important
It may
thing.
change some resources relatively because some are gas resources and some are electric
That's
resources.
right.
In terms
Okay.
of what's included and not included, you can go back to slide 34 to look at kind of ins and outs and avoided costs.
Yeah.
So if there's something there that you want to make a written comment about, just to let us know you think that there's a more appropriate treatment. This was our treatment of what we thought was a best approximation of what was in and what was out.
Okay, and then can I do one more? The LBNL study you used to affect EE standards, you know that the SELT report, the load forecast, currently incorporates future building codes and standards. So I'm assuming you're doing stretch something beyond what we know about that's currently incorporated into the load forecast.
Yes, it's meant to be incremental.
Okay, thank you.
We go to the large onshore wind, and this is Peter Shattuck again, formerly of E&E, renamed Acadia Center 20 minutes ago. There's your announcement. So this goes back a little bit to this morning's discussion of a couple of the transmission lines, and would encourage you, since some of the proposals on the table for transmission would include wind, and that could affect both the capacity factor of production on those lines and the assumed cost of transmission to bring that wind into the system, that one of those lines be HVDC, pure hydro coming in, and one be AC that could pick up wind in region. So it spans back to the other, this morning's discussion, but it also gets at some of the resources here.
Hi, Jennifer Nelson with Sussex Economic Advisors. I actually have a lot of questions on just how the net costs are calculated, and I just want to
Give us your best.
confirm that there will be tables provided that sort of itemize what each individual cost and benefit to come up with these numbers. Just because I'd like to know a little bit more about, what the cost is. Is the total cost just the avoided cost? And then are what the ratepayers have to pay for certain programs that are included, as well as what the benefits are that go into these net costs. So that's my main question, is that if there will be tables provided for each of these resources that really dig into the details on what the net costs are.
The tables that are in our memo break it out to some extent. They don't break out every possible avenue of this. It's a table that's meant to a very long table that has a lot of different columns in it. Not every single element of avoided cost is in there individually, no, but they are broken down more than what we showed here.
Okay, and just to follow up then, if you could just describe briefly what the benefits then, that you don't have to keep going into detail, but I'm just curious as to what benefits are being included in the cost of the net.
The only benefits that we're including are avoided costs. We're not including other kinds of benefits. We're only looking at avoided costs. So we're not looking at other kinds of.
Okay, thank you, that clarifies. So the avoided costs are on the benefit side, so then what is on the cost column, on the cost side?
The levelized cost of capital, O&M, fuel. Sometimes transmission.
Excuse me, what about renewable energy certificates? Are they netted? Is this a customer cost or is it a net cost of the generation after the subsidies? That's the
Everything in here is incremental to our existing policies, and so there is no REC or SREC or any kind of incentive that is already existing that you would take out of the cost. So the way that you could bring about having this investment in renewables could be to extend or expand RPS. And in that case, there would be a REC, there would be an SREC, but the costs are the same. That's just shifting who's paying for them.
So today, there's a renewable energy certificate for, say, wind. So is your cost net of the renewable certificate value that customers are paying, or is it looking at maybe some extension of that in the future and not counting the current subsidy?
It doesn't have any cost of, there's no REC in these calculations because we're looking at beyond our current RPSs.
Haskell Werlin, Solar Design Associates, and Mass Solar Policy Council. I want to go back to slide 42 through 44, the residential, commercial, and utility scale solar. First of all, these numbers are based on 2013 DOER reports, and we have had a lot of growth in particularly utility scale since 2013. So incorporating the 2013 figures and cumulatively up to 2014 would make a difference. These look awfully low. We're approaching 700 megawatts in service currently. We're on a trajectory towards 1,600 megawatts, so I think that we should revisit the source of these.
So everything that you see here is incremental to existing policy. So these are over and above what's in our existing policy.
I thought you were heading toward talking about the costs, but you're talking about the potentials?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, SREC 2 policy rolls out and we achieve the 1,600 megawatts, and then this is all incremental to that. Is that clear? I mean,
yeah, it seems low.
Okay.
So, there's a lot of questions. I'm going to let Liz just finish the analysis and then we can pick up with this and go back to it. But I want to make sure that everything is out here and you see the whole supply curve. Should have another 15 minutes for questions.
So before I put the supply curves up here so you can see what we're working on, I wanted to show you what some of our thoughts are about potential thresholds for economic feasibility. So the supply curves have on them our estimation of what is technically feasible for each one of these resources. We overlay on that an assessment of the threshold for economic feasibility. What we're putting on so far, these are things that we're putting forward as an idea of how to examine this. It's obviously something that people in the room will have a lot to say about in terms of what would be an appropriate threshold for economic feasibility, and there are going to be a lot of different opinions about that. But here's a place to start. And what we're doing here is looking at the cost of adding a natural gas pipeline. And so when we think about that cost, it's not any particular gas pipeline, it's more the idea of a gas pipeline. And when we're thinking about the cost of this pipeline, we're imagining that there were available to us an infinite number of 1 MMBTU sized pipelines, right? There's no minimum size to it, there's no maximum size to it. It's just an idea of a pipeline. We're taking the cost levels to try to get at that per MMBTU cost of the pipeline from looking at what the AIM is said to cost. That's where we're taking those numbers from. And then we're looking at two different capacity use levels for the pipeline, or infinite number of kind of pipelines, however you want to think about it. And in both of them, we have the idea of a 95% expected utilization during the constraint period. And that is, that 95%, I say here, it's chosen to represent the level of pipeline utilization at which operational flow orders are typically declared. So that's where we're getting the 95% as being, there's evidence that when you reach 95% that you're entering into a constraint. So that's where that comes from. Then the other question of it is, how often would you have a constraint like that? You have the pipeline there 365 days of the year, but how often are you entering into a constraint period? And we have two different ways of looking at that here. One is that there would be a constraint period like that, something like 80% of all the winter days. So the winter days are 5 months, 80% of those we end up in this situation where there were operational flow orders being called. And the other idea is that that would just happen for 20% of those days. So these are two very different ideas of how much the pipeline, once you built it, whatever size it was, how much that pipeline would actually get used. So that are designed in a way to sort of abstract from what the size of the pipeline is. I wanted to remind you that this is here for the purpose of giving one idea of what a potential economic threshold would be. We will also think about pipeline cost at another moment in the study, and that's when we come around to balancing. And when we reach that moment of trying to balance capacity and demand in each of our scenarios, that pipeline would be one of the things that we would consider in terms of something that could be used to balance. So when we do that, we are not going to abstract from minimum and maximum sizes of pipeline or of other kinds of resources. That's important. If the difference between capacity and demand is very small, then the answer to what's the most economic resource to fulfill that is going to be different than if the difference between capacity and demand is very large. And we need to take that into consideration in that balancing moment of the analysis. Okay? But this has a different purpose. We're just trying to get an idea of generically what does a pipeline cost us. We could do any one or all of these different kinds of alternative resources, and they have a certain cost to us on an annual basis. The idea with a threshold for economic feasibility is that regardless of how you determine it, you would want to implement all of those measures up until whatever your threshold is, because once you get to the threshold, then whatever's on the threshold is less expensive and you should do that. Okay? But we want to make sure that the threshold that we're using is the right one that makes good sense in policy. And you can see here at the higher utilization, the pipeline is $4 per MMBTU on an annual basis. At the lower utilization, it's $18 on an MMBTU basis. This is just the cost of the pipeline, just the cost of that capacity for the pipeline. It's not the fuel cost. Because we do our supply curve analysis on a net basis, we're taking fuel costs into consideration in terms of what's avoided for each one of those resources. That's where you find the fuel cost. Here is just making sure enough fuel gets to you. It's purely that pipeline cost. That's really tiny, sorry about that. So we're trying to get a lot of information up here in one place because it's really helpful to look at these different charts together. So I'll lead you through it a little bit so you can get an idea for what it is. And then, I'm terrible at the pointer, so I gesture. Sorry, pointer failure. This is the 2015 supply curve. We're going to show you similar images for 2020 and for 2030. One thing that's going to be different between them that I want to flag right away is that for 2015, we're showing it in, our width is in billion BTUs. When we do the 2020 and the 2030, it's going to be in trillion BTUs. We like to keep our axes parallel so we don't confuse people, but here, if we had done them all in trillion BTUs, then all of this is hiding right here. You can't see it at all. So flag it for you. This is billions. The next two is trillions, so nobody is confused by that. The heights stay the same for all three. Okay? Top one goes from 8,000 at the top, negative 2,000 at the bottom. The other years will look exactly the same. These are our resources lined up from least expensive to most expensive. The widths are an estimate of the annual MMBTUs in gas that could be displaced from these resources. Here, we zoom in on the small band of dollar values right around zero. Okay? So this is $100 and this is a negative $100. That's so we can see what's going on there. If we don't do that, if we draw these economic thresholds, you can't see them at all. They look the same as the zero line. Okay? So this gives you the zoom in there. And then we have a table over here that's giving exactly the same information. And so it's walking through the names, the annual net levelized costs, and the annual savings potential for each of these blocks over here in the same order that they're shown here. When you see the gray lines, that's where the pipeline threshold comes in at the two different levels, and where the resources above that are less expensive than those pipelines. The resources below it are more expensive. All the resources that have negative costs are in blue. All the resources that have positive costs are in red. Okay? And all three of the years are going to look just like this, the same setup, so that we can all understand it and get a feeling for it. So what we see is that depending on which of these two example thresholds we're using, that there's a little bit difference in what resources are considered economically feasible. When we're looking at the lower pipeline value, $4, then if all of these resources that have negative net costs in 2015 are coming in as economic. There are some various EE resources, anaerobic digestion, landfill gas, converted hydro, the small CHPs, and solar hot water. When you look at the little bit higher pipeline cost, a few more resources meet the threshold. And we get biomass thermal and ground source heat pumps onto the list. If we had a different threshold, then that break would fall in a different place. Okay? So this just gives us an idea of how to do the analysis, and then of course, which of the resources that we'll end up putting into the low demand case will depend on the selection of the threshold. Now, those resources that are higher than the threshold that's selected, we'll hold on to those, and if they have a value to us in terms of addressing winter peak constraint periods, then we'll re-examine them for balancing at the end of the analysis to say, could we use these resources to be the most economic resource or set of resources to address a peak constraint situation. Thank you. This is the 2020 curve, now we're in trillions. A lot more resources available to us. Remember I said that we've done the other one in trillions, it's just a tiny little thing over here. Right? So we're in trillions, and looking out into the future, we have more resources available to us because there were a number of resources that we determined there was no increment that we felt was technically feasible in 2015, whereas here there are a lot more resources that we feel would be technically feasible by 2020. You can see that the comparison to the lower pipeline threshold and then the list of resources that are less expensive than that. You pull in a few more resources when you go to the higher pipeline cost. Again, we have EE here. We have a couple different kinds of CHP, the anaerobic digestion, landfill gas, the converted hydro, solar hot water. There's EEs, there was electric and gas. And then when you go to the higher pipeline cost, you pull in some biomass thermal and some heat pump. So these are all the resources that, given this example set of thresholds, would be less expensive than the threshold. Can I see the 2030? And here's the 2030. Now there's a whole lot more that's available by that time in terms of what will be technically feasible. And again, the determination of what is economically feasible depends on what kind of threshold that we pick. You can see the same, it's a similar set of resources that are coming out as being less expensive, and these resources that are not making the list would be reconsidered if they have something to offer in terms of addressing winter peak constraint. So this is the idea of how the supply curve analysis works, the feasibility analysis works, that we, using our best judgment and publicly available sources, we are making a determination of what is technically feasible in each one of these years. We take that information along with what we think the most likely cost is for those resources in each of those years. We put it up on a supply curve, and then we want to assess it against some threshold for economic feasibility. We're offering as a beginning and entry point into a discussion of what's economically feasible, the cost of example pipeline at two different levels of utilization, and finding that if you use that as your marker, as your threshold, there's a certain set of resources that are economically feasible, and we would add to the low demand case. There are other resources that are not economically feasible on an annual basis. If some of those have value to us in addressing a winter peak constraint event, we'll re-examine them when we come to balancing.
We've got almost 15 minutes for questions. We'll just throw this into the hopper now. Jerry, you were next on the line. Please pass that. And Earl, we'll work our way back.
Thanks. Well, my questions are about energy efficiency.
Jerry, a little closer to my box.
Is that better?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So first of all, I definitely agree with the LBL dollar.
I'm not hearing.
Is this better?
Yeah, it's got to keep
All right, we just do it. So I definitely agree that the LBL dollar numbers are low, so I'm not sure what to do about that. You might want to take a further look at that. But I wonder how you reach the cost numbers, and in particular the low income cost numbers, because from what I could see of the LBL study, they don't separate out. They don't separate out low income at all from the general.
No, they don't.
And in fact, they show 2010 expense versus 29 savings, so I'm not even sure what you're looking at.
So we took the budgets from the LBNL study. In terms of costs, we used the 2015 plan for Massachusetts specifically. We basically held those costs flat in real terms over time. So they come from the plan, from the 2015 plan is the source for cost data. I can double check the low income. It does look strange to me as well, double check it. I just saw it yesterday versus the avoided costs. So it was strange to me that it wasn't cost effective in 2015. I don't think it would have passed that way.
Well, right, and in fact, the other thing that struck me was that residential PV, according to these charts, is cheaper, so maybe we should all be doing that.
In terms of the energy efficiency and the threshold, Tina's in the room, but my understanding that I may get corrected in is that the all cost effective is on a portfolio basis. Is that incorrect?
That's correct, but this breaks it out by sector.
Right, but if the determination for Massachusetts is on a portfolio level, and that would explain why there are low-income measures that don't meet the constraint. But as a portfolio, the whole portfolio meets the constraint.
Well, that might explain the all cost effective, wouldn't explain the cost ineffective. And low income goes up to as cost
Well,
effective.
if the consideration is if you put the entire portfolio of EE measures together and then ask, is this portfolio all cost effective?
The portfolio by sector.
By sector, okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, so we should probably let's look at this further on.
We'll take a look.
Circle back at low income.
But the other related question I have is whether you look at all at energy efficiency costs are really curves, not data points like this. It depends on how much you do, the measurements, and things like that. So I wonder if you took that into account.
So in terms of the efficiency costs, there are a number of studies that we looked at. Many of the recent studies that have looked at recent history, and a lot of them don't capture the 2013 to 2015 period, which is the most recent three-year plan for Massachusetts, do show that in real terms, costs have not necessarily increased as anticipated over time. So that's the assumption we're using today. The LBNL study did assume a cost increase that we didn't take that assumption in our projections. And so again, we hold the costs flat over real time, in real terms over time, basically because there are scale efficiencies that can still be achieved. There will be new measures. We've modeled heat pumps separately as a separate measure. There will be new measures with increased costs, but we do feel that economies of scale over time and continuing decline for new technologies, which is what we have seen, that costs do decline for new technologies, will offset some of those new measures coming in.
In our national work on this topic, in terms of what is the curve for EE costs, what we found is people often express it as a U-shaped curve, but there's great evidence for the declining part of the curve, that costs decline as the size of programs increases. There's very little evidence on the other side on the increase that's much more speculative. So when you're looking at that, it's just something to consider in terms of that U-shaped curve, that we know a lot about the trend down and very, very little about the existence of a trend up.
Well,
And
okay. But we'll be happy to work with you on these details.
Just one more thing I wanted to add, and certainly we've been talking about the LBNL study and how much efficiency. This projects about 2.5 to 2.75% moving forward, so within that range, typically even on the U-shaped curves, things look pretty flat cost-wise. When you start to see the bow up is really once you get past 3%. So
Excuse me, that's percent of sales, incremental.
savings as a percent of sales, correct.
Not incremental.
Hi, Pearl Hartman from E2. First, a sort of a generic comment. All of your figures here are in terms of MMBTU, but ultimately what we need are megawatts. So I'm wondering if you're planning, I know there's a conversion that can be done, but just in terms of all the data we get is we've got 8,000 megawatts retiring and we're going to get 1,600 megawatts of solar, et cetera. So are you going to, when you present it, also show for the general public what the megawatt impact is?
So let me give you two answers to that. The first is that we're not approaching this as a purely electric sector problem. We're interested in the electric sector as its gas requirements feed into our gas model. So we're interested in both electric side and gas side issues. We're used to looking at electric side problems in terms of megawatt hours, and that's an easier number for people to follow and associate it with what other things they know about it. That's why we're presenting the dollar per megawatt numbers here so people can see that. We have our specific electric sector model that gives its own results. The results of that will feed into the gas model, and we can certainly show those electric sector results to say, here's the electric sector part of the modeling, just so the
the readers of our eventual report can understand what assumptions were made there that then fed into gas requirements.
Could I just do one more on efficiency?
Question or comment?
What's that?
Question or comment?
Question. In terms of efficiency, I know that there are countries and cities in Europe, like Copenhagen and others, that are much more efficient than we are. I don't know if there's any studies on what they've done there, but is that anything you've looked at?
I have not. I was hoping for something more Northeast or Massachusetts specific, but if we do have to go overseas and people are accepting of that, I'm fine with that. I'm basically reaching out with the hope that there's some feedback on this in terms of good sources.
And I think that the way that we would incorporate that is much less to change what we have now and more to add additional blocks of energy efficiency so that we can capture the appropriate costs of those yet another increment on top of what we have here and have it as being two separate values. Maybe one would be a little less expensive and one would be a little more expensive.
Rich Cowan from Drake. A rapid fire question is, transmission was financed over a 30-year period in the calculate costs. Are all the other resources also financed, like solar, over 30 years, or some of them financed over 20 years?
No, we have plant lifetime assumptions that are specific to each technology. I think the shortest one was the small CHP facility, which is 10 years, and some of the longest ones I think were 30, but they're specific to each technology.
You just published those numbers for each technology would be good. Okay, the second one was following up on the last question. I understand this is converting to gas, and I support the idea of converting to gas, because how else will we know how much gas pipeline capacity we need? However, when you use it, when you have a specific number of megawatts generated or not used, then you have to consider what that electricity is being used for at peak hour today, 2020, 2025. On a very cold day right now, a lot of that additional electricity demand is for electric resistance heating. In 5 years, there'll probably be very little electric resistance heating because most of that will be converted over to heat pump heating, which has a different ratio of conversion from electricity megawatts to gas. So I just ask you to include that as part of the analysis. The other question is, in terms of gas...
That wasn't a question, so it's the next one a question?
Next one is a question.
Okay.
Sure. Rapid fire. Gas pipelines added. Gas pipelines added. You're including the cost of the construction of the pipeline, whether it be Spectra Energy or Kinder Morgan or whatever. But what about the if that pipeline is added, the cost of when my mom converted to gas, she got a gas line brought in 90 feet from the street, and LDCs and expanding their distribution networks, which because of the gas leak spill can be passed on to the consumer. Are all of those expansion costs of gas pipeline infrastructure included, or only the transmission?
My understanding from, and Farhad, you can remind me of what we talked about earlier in the week, but that we're not including gas expansion beyond what is already in the forecast. Is that correct?
That's correct.
If you add a pipeline, you'll get more expansion, I think, because you have ability to do that.
Okay, I have a question over here. We have a few more minutes for questions.
Ken Berthew, North Portland Pipeline Action. Just a clarifying question on renewable portfolio standards. Where does that actually show up? You said that, like, for wind as an example, that was above and beyond the RPS?
It's just not considering an RPS. And so you could, yeah, I mean, the RPS is in the reference case. And so this is above and beyond the reference case, right? In terms of the cost of it, there's no REC involved. If you had a REC, it would just distribute the cost of the resource differently. So.
Okay, well, let me try this one. For Massachusetts, we've got in the RPS 2,000 megawatts between now and 2020. Where does that show up? Is that going to show up in the base case?
In the base case.
Okay. Thank you.
So for all 6 New England states, we're including in the base case enough renewables to satisfy their RPS standards, taking into consideration any changes to load because that would affect what the RPS standards were.
Craig Alton-Foss with Better Future Project. I appreciate that you are looking at the full technical range. I'm just wondering, in the final study, if you'll be publishing that full technical range, including the things you determine are not cost-effective in either the normal situation or the peak demand scenario, so that policymakers and advocates can have access to that data about the full range of technical solutions. So if they want to price in the cost of other externalities into their cost assessment, they have the freedom to do that.
I'll tell you what my understanding and intention is, and then DOER can respond if they had a different understanding. But the feasibility analysis, which you're seeing sort of in shorthand form here in the slides, will be a chapter in the report, including all of the measures and whether or not they were considered to be economically feasible by either standard.
So let me ask, is there any question on the phone? Okay, well, I know there are a few more questions, but we're at 2 and I want to keep everybody on track here. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a break in 1 second for 15 minutes, and I want to show you what we're doing after the break, because I'd like you to go after the break, just get started. So we would like to break you now into 4 different groups so that you can talk among people either in the same industry as you or a loosely similar perspective. We're not assuming you within any of these groups there's going to be the same perspective, but just a different way of arranging you for the next conversation. So we'll take the environmental, consumer, NGOs, citizen groups, and individuals, which is probably half of you, and we'll put you into room B, where hopefully there's still some more food, and you have your own room over there, and I'd say bring a few more chairs. We'll take the state agencies and local government, and we'll leave you over here, and then for the, how many people would be in the gas industry group? Okay, so we're going to put you, there's a little room when you go out over there, and the electric, how about the electric industry folks? A little bit more? No? Less? Yeah, and I know National Grid, and you can't figure out where to go. So we'll put them right across the hall. Will be the gas folks, and next to them the electric state people here. So now let me tell you what we'd like you to do. Introduce yourselves, and then share your perspectives with each other on the feasibility analysis that you've just seen. You know, we started hearing some things right now. Are there things missing? Are there things that don't seem right? Think about the avoided cost, the thresholds, and then try and develop some comments that you want to give back. See if you can brainstorm and if you can converge on some comments. Maybe harder with the bigger group, but you don't need a consensus on the comments. You could say there's a range of opinion on an issue, but just come back with 5 minutes of comments that you think are most important from what you've heard so far, either what's missing or what you'd recommend or what you think is great. And we'll then hear from each group, appoint 1 or 2 spokespeople from each group so we can get those out. If during your question conversation there are some other key questions that you didn't get to, or you think are really important, or in your conversations realize, I thought I understood it, but now when we're talking about it, I'm not so sure. Bring those back. We'll try and get those addressed too. So we will have, let's see, the way it's going to work is it's 5 after. In a little 10 minutes, you'll start at 2:15, and then we'll give you, what did we say, an hour. Wait. 50 minutes. 50 minutes. You'll have 50 minutes in your group. We'll come back. We'll have 5 minutes from each group and 5 minutes for questions, okay? So is this a question about what we're about to do? Yes.
On the environmental consumer group, is there any reason not to break it up into a renewable clean energy group and then the rest, then the other?
If you guys want to get in there and separate off, you want a renewable and clean energy,